Screams echo from an adjoining room as the soon-to-be notorious gangster Whitey Bulger looks into the eyes of a man he does not know is a CIA agent, an agent committing a crime that will forever shame the agency. Bulger, hallucinating madly, sees the man's skin melt from his face as he repeats slowly, "You work for us." Is this what made the young Bulger into a maniacal killer? Today, we'll lift the lid off this horrifying secret, but first let's have a look at the thousands of men who had prison testicle transplants. The San Quentin prison testicle experiments. In the 1920s, it was wrongly believed by some people that if a man was incapable of having children or achieving an erection, someone else's testicles could be transplanted onto his body to replace his removed testicles. If some older men had about $10,000, around $150,000 today, they could get a fresh pair of balls. We promise you, we aren't making this up. So how do you test such operations? Chimpanzees? Actually, a paper we read said chimps were really expensive. You had to import them and look after them. Humans were way cheaper, and in prisons, people had no rights. The man for this job was San Quentin Chief Surgeon Leo Stanley. He was doing prison experiments in which he'd wait for a guy to be executed and then quickly whip off his balls. He could do this as he was the prison pathologist. He put the grapes on ice and later he'd surgically attach them to another prisoner whose balls he already removed. He'd usually choose aged prisoners because he wanted to see if the old guy could get the young guy's spunk. Stanley was one of those people who viewed criminals as the scum of the earth, and that's why he didn't mind doing tests on them. In fact, many of his experiments consisted of attaching animal testicles to prisoners. This is how his mind worked. In his memoir, he wrote about a guy that forged a $5 check, an insignificant crime. Still, Stanley said, he was a typical prison malingerer, perfect specimen for any proponent of euthanasia or painless elimination of the socially unfit. Stanley said such men had a moral disease, which is why he felt it was fine to sterilize hundreds of them so when they did get out of prison they couldn't pass on their disease to their children. Not surprisingly, not many prisoners jumped at the chance of losing their testicles to have them replaced with some animal gonads, so Stanley put up a sign in the prison yard selling sterilization to the prisoners. It said, "This simple operation prevents the man from producing children, but it does not interfere with his normal pleasures. In fact, it is claimed that sexual vigor is increased." In one of the many similar cases, he took the balls off a corpse and surgically attached them to a 72-year-old prisoner. Stanley wrote that after the operation, the old guy was as lively as a young colt. The rhyme, liar, liar, pants on fire can have two meanings here, considering the pain men felt after the operation. Stanley still used the testicles from goats, boars, rams, and deer, which he then took to the aged prisoner whose scrotum was about to be emptied and refilled. He believed this gave the guy some extra testosterone. Despite what Stanley wrote at times, these old guys with new balls weren't suddenly running around like 15-year-old boys who discovered how to take the parental controls off their iPhones. So Stanley changed course, mashing the donor balls into a fine paste and injecting that into the poor fella's abdomen. Well, that didn't work either. Still, Stanley said while this guy might not be making babies again, he believed the mixture could cure depression and asthma. In 1922, the Los Angeles Times reported that Stanley implanted goat glands into 1,000 inmates over a period of weeks. The article explained that he took the goat glands and cut them into very small slices, after which he injected them into the prisoners' abdomens. Stanley wrote in his notes, one melancholic who would not talk or show any activity whatever was observed to have an erection a few days after implantation. News traveled about his experiments. In 1919, the United Press Dispatch wrote, "Youth is returning to the old man who received the life-giving gland from Tom Belton, the merced murderer who was hanged last Friday." The prison physicians today stated that he had a better appetite and increased pulse. By the time Stanley retired, he'd performed about 10,000 testicular implants in the prison. Now, let's look at a case that has caused the U.S. government eternal embarrassment: Tuskegee syphilis experiment. In 1933, a doctor started typing up a medical article that would cause decades of shame for the USA. Today, you'll hear the word syphilis a few times, so it's best you know something about it. Before syphilis became easily treatable with antibiotics, it was one of the biggest killers in the world. The disease produced ugly sores and often made the victim look like something out of a horror movie. This bacterial infection would quite literally rearrange people's faces before it killed them. Since it was a sexually transmitted disease, it was very stigmatized. Sufferers became outcasts, pariahs, and it wasn't always easy to hide since people often lost their noses. In the 1700s in London, there was even a no-nose club where such monsters could drink booze in peace. Knowing little factoids like this makes it all the more disturbing when you hear that the United States Public Health Service and the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, in their experiments, chose not to treat this nose-eating, face-transforming stigmatized disease for around 600 African Americans between 1932 and 1972. That's right, they knowingly destroyed these men's lives in the name of science, of course. You also need to know that Alexander Fleming accidentally discovered penicillin in 1928. However, it didn't become the standard treatment for syphilis until 1947. Still, these men could have been treated during the many decades of the experiments, and prior to 1947, physicians did have some ways to treat the disease. The CDC and its partner knew they were killing people by not treating them, and worse, when these victims went to doctors who knew about the experiment, they were gaslit. They were never told what was wrong with them, instead being told their sickness was in their heads. In the 1920s, 36% of the 27,000 residents of Tuskegee in Macon County, Alabama, were infected with syphilis. This was the highest concentration of syphilis in the USA. Many of these people were black, with 82% of the town's residents being African American. These men weren't in prison, but they were viewed as prison prospects in this highly racist era. The reason they were used as guinea pigs was because their low education and the poverty they lived in. They were seen as expendable. One doctor who was part of the study wrote, "We must remember we're dealing with a group of people who are illiterate, have no conception of time, and whose personal history is always indefinite." We should also say that it wasn't only white folks conducting these studies, though race certainly mattered here. Many of the doctors and nurses involved were also African Americans. The Tuskegee Institute and the two main hospitals conducting the study were known as African American institutions, but it's thought many of the people involved didn't know these men wouldn't be treated, at least at some point in time. But if we're going to put the blame on one person, that would be the study founder, Mr. Taliaferro Clark, the head of public health, who had the full backing of the U.S. government. He was one of many top dogs in the study. They wanted to know if syphilis affected black folks in the same way it affected white folks. It was generally thought race mattered, and some said if left untreated, black people's bodies might be better at fighting syphilis. This wasn't true at all. They weren't told they had syphilis, but that they had bad blood. The men were then informed that if they kept going back to see the doctor, they'd get free lunches on every visit. Their medical care would be free, as would their transportation costs. Seemed like a good deal for their bad blood. They weren't treated at all, only given things that did nothing to help their condition, such as vitamins and tonics. They were also told that if their bad blood killed them, their families would get a $50 burial stipend. Also, besides the free stuff, at the end of the year they got a bonus of $25. When World War II came around, they also got out of the draft because the health authorities managed to convince the Macon County Draft Board not to take them. Over the years, some of these men became very ill. Eventually, over 100 of them died from the disease. Secretly, their autopsies were analyzed for what doctors considered important data. Just as shocking is the fact that since the guys didn't know they had syphilis, wives and girlfriends almost certainly got it in many cases. Since there's a thing called congenital syphilis, 19 children were needlessly born with syphilis. As one journalist wrote, the lives of these black men and many of their families were mostly ruined. If it hadn't been for a whistleblower, we might not have ever known about this highly unethical study. Just like many of the things we'll talk about today, the authorities would have always kept it a secret. A lawsuit in 1974 led to embarrassment and also a settlement of $10 million. The biggest payout to just one person was only $40,000. Most people got less than $20,000. This paltry sum after their life of eminently treatable pain in what was called an unethical, immoral, and racist study. We can say the same about this next case, Guatemala. In 1997, President Bill Clinton apologized for the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. This man of exemplary moral character told the world the United States government did something that was wrong, deeply, profoundly, morally wrong. Most Americans wondered how such a terrible experiment could have taken place, but we're glad this kind of thing was a one-off, right? In 2010, President Barack Obama was the next POTUS to issue an apology for horrific experiments conducted on people the U.S. government considered valueless. This time, the studies happened in the country of Guatemala between 1946 and 1948. Sexually transmitted diseases, including syphilis, were still a huge problem in the U.S., especially where soldiers were concerned. During World War II, American servicemen traveled the globe and on their way picked up various diseases. It was estimated about 350,000 soldiers had STDs, which was costing the American government about $34 million a year. That's about $568 million in today's money. Penicillin was already known to cure syphilis, but its effectiveness was still being debated, and the U.S. wanted to know if it would work on any number of STDs. A surgeon named John Charles Cutler, who'd already worked at the Tuskegee study, then decided some test subjects were needed. Again, the poor were chosen. So he made a deal with some Guatemalan physicians and was soon told the U.S. had free reign in Guatemala prisons, mental hospitals, and, wait for it, orphanages. You'll see later that this wasn't actually that unusual. Using various methods, including an injection to the back of the skull, they gave 1,308 people STDs, including gonorrhea, cancroid, and syphilis. These Guatemalan soldiers, prisoners, sex workers, orphans, and psychiatric patients were aged 10 to 72. In some instances, female sex workers were infected through their cervixes and then told to go into these institutions and sleep with the men inside. It was quite common and legal then for prostitutes to enter prisons or army barracks. The U.S. physicians paid them for this. One of the doctors noted that it wasn't easy controlling the women. He wrote in a study paper, "Unfortunately, our female donor is leaving her profession for marriage and is no longer available." Cutler wrote that he was worried someone might blow the lid on the experiments, saying in one letter, "A few words to the wrong person here or even at home might wreck it or parts of it." In another letter, he had a different opinion on the experiment, saying, "I'm a bit, in fact more than a bit, leery of the experiment with the insane people. They cannot give consent, do not know what's going on, and if some goody organization got wind of the work, they would raise a lot of smoke." We know the truth about these experiments, though, through these letters and other documents discovered after Cutler's death in 2003. Other study notes were dug up, some of them quite shocking. One note featured a woman named Berta who got sick after seeing Dr. Cutler. The note reads, "On August 23rd, Dr. Cutler wrote that Berta appeared as if she was going to die, but he did not specify why. That same day, he put gonorrheal pus from another male subject into both of Berta's eyes, as well as in her urethra and rectum. He also reinfected her with syphilis. 3 days later, Berta's eyes were full of pus, and she was bleeding internally. She then died. 83 people died in all during the experiments, but it's not clear what killed them in some of the cases. What is clear is that some people died in what was a government-sponsored murder. President Obama said it was a crime against humanity. Hillary Clinton, then Secretary of State, said she was outraged and that the experiments were reprehensible and abhorrent. Strong language, but it didn't affect what happened in the courts. These poor Guatemalans and their families got an apology, but unlike the patients in Tuskegee, they didn't receive any compensation. As you'll now see, doing such things on home turf can be costly. The Monster Study. The mastermind of the Monster Study was a psychologist named Wendell Johnson. His lifelong passion was studying speech, specifically people with stutters or stammers. One of the reasons was that he grew up with a stutter, by all accounts a severe one. He was as smart as a whip in school, becoming the class president and valedictorian, but he had that terrible stutter, something that affected him deeply. He wrote once, "I became a speech pathologist because I needed one." The problem with speech issues, especially back then, is they weren't very well understood. Even now, we don't know exactly why people stammer. There are many reasons, none of which Johnson understood decades ago. Johnson had an idea and enlisted his clinical psychology graduate students to help him. He told them that he thought children stuttered only because as kids they've been scolded for minor speech problems, which then became severe stutters. Once they'd been told they stuttered, they got nervous every time they spoke, and their stutter worsened. Ergo, Johnson said, people stutter because they're told they do. It's a matter of feeling under pressure. But how could he prove this? On January 17, 1939, he traveled to the Children's Orphanage in Davenport, Iowa, which, considering the conditions of the time, was just about as bad for a child as going to a prison for an adult. He traveled there with his assistant, Mary. Thanks to the Great Depression, orphans were aplenty. Johnson had about 600 of them to choose from, but he picked out 22. The task was simple. Mary took the 22 kids aside. Only 10 of them had obvious stutters. First, she took the 10 stutterers and told them to speak. Even though they stuttered, 5 of them in Group 1A were told, "You do not stutter, your speech is fine." The other 5 in Group 1B were told, "Yes, your speech is as bad as people say." This way, they could see if what they said affected the stutterer's speech. Things were worse for the 12 non-stutterers that were now left in Groups 2A and 2B. Johnson and Mary wanted to find out if you can actually make a kid who spoke fine stutter by destroying his or her sense of self-worth and telling them they had a speech impediment. Only 6 kids were in this group. The other 6 were complimented on their perfect speech. Now, you can only imagine how this messed up the kids that didn't stutter when they were told by doctors that they stuttered. Some were young as 5, and here were serious-looking adults in white lab coats telling them they couldn't speak right. These sessions went on for 6 months, too. It was okay for the stuttering kids in the other group. They just kept being told, "You'll outgrow the stuttering and you'll be able to speak much better than you're speaking now. Pay no attention to what others say about your speaking ability." Then, they'd go over to the kids who spoke fine and tell them, "The staff has come to the conclusion that you have a great deal of trouble with your speech. You must try to stop yourself immediately. Use your willpower. Do anything to keep from stuttering. Do not ever speak unless you can do it right." The other researchers who were watching this took notes about what happened to the kids as the experiments went on. One of them wrote about a young girl who spoke fluently but was told the opposite. She wrote, "It was very difficult to get her to speak, although she spoke very freely the month before." Talking about a 9-year-old named Betty Romp, she wrote that she practically refuses to talk. One girl became much more conscious of herself and she talked less. When asked why she talked less, the girl replied, "Because I'm afraid I can't speak." She and others in her group stopped talking in class. Some could no longer do their homework. An 11-year-old boy said, "My words just won't come out. It feels like they're stuck in my head." They weren't stuttering, they just lost all their confidence. These kids thought they were going mad. They heard their words came out fine, but these adults were telling them a different story. Not only that, but they were friends with the stuttering kids and they heard them stutter, and those kids were being told they didn't stutter while they were being told the opposite. It made no sense, but then adults wouldn't just lie, right? Johnson and Mary, of course, thought they'd get all the stuttering kids not to stutter and the non-stuttering kids to stutter. Still, all they did was make the non-stuttering kids insecure about their speech, and they gave the stuttering kids some serious mental health problems. The kids were never told it was a game, not until later when Johnson realized he'd really screwed up their minds. What he couldn't know then is some of them would have trouble speaking for the rest of their lives. Other psychologists heard about the study and could not believe what they were hearing. That's why it's called the monster study. One of them later wrote, "It reminded people of the Nazi experiments on human subjects." The other professors at the time told him that it would ruin his reputation to publish the data. It was chilling and disturbing. Mary later admitted it was wrong. She said she regretted it all but put a lot of blame on Johnson because he hadn't gone back to the orphanage and done follow-up work. Those kids had been left alone with their negative thoughts. The public might not have heard anything about it if it wasn't for a journalist who published a story in 2001. In 2007, 7 of the victims were compensated to the tune of $1.2 million. All of them were in their 70s and 80s, and every one of them claimed to have lifelong psychological and emotional scars. Now for some brutal physical torture sponsored by your favorite American companies. The worst place in the world. One of the scariest things ever said by any human is this: "All I saw before me were acres of skin." It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time. Acres of skin. Sounds like something from a horror movie, something a brain-eating zombie or blood-sucking vampire would say. But these were the words of a scientist and human experimentation advocate named Albert Kligman. He was referring to the first time he walked into the Holmesburg prison, aka the Terrordrome. That day he saw hundreds of prisoners hanging around who he knew had zero rights, so he could do what he wanted to them. He was given free rein to experiment on those men, which was a total breach of their human rights, the Hippocratic Oath, and it has to be said, the Nuremberg Code. Kligman was certainly a piece of work. After watching a few prisoners mill around and speaking to some of them, he called them an idle collection of humanity. He was then given a bunch of cash, all greenlit by the US government, to test various chemicals on the prisoners. Some of the money came from the US Army, most of the cash came from Johnson & Johnson and Dow Chemicals. The prisoners didn't know what they were getting into when they accepted a payment to take part in what they were being told were harmless trials. They didn't know they were being tested with chemicals that would blister their skin. They weren't told about the radiation, the drugs that made them half mad, the compounds that caused cancer, and the injections that gave them herpes and staphylococcus. There are reports of prisoners who had their skin burned so badly it became like leather. One guy said they almost burned his testicles off. One of the female victims later said, "They used my body. They did things to me that were inhuman. I feel less than a woman because of the things they did to me. This brought me pain, a lot of pain." It sounds like horror, but of course all horror movies take their inspiration from somewhere. Did you ever watch Human Centipede? Well, one of the experiments in this prison was to sew parts of dead people onto the prisoner's body to see if the organs would grow back. We're not kidding you. Imagine walking around with a dead man's finger stitched to your back. In another experiment, they smeared prisoners' feet with fungi. The men had to keep special boots on for a week, which gave them ringworms. Dow Chemical paid Kligman a massive $10,000 for him to test the prisoners with a carcinogen found in Agent Orange. In small doses, it might not be too bad, but Dow told Kligman to rub 468 times more of this stuff on them than they thought to be safe. Johnson & Johnson had the doctor test a cream that blistered prisoners' skin and created ulcers that leaked white pus. One prisoner said that it felt like his whole body was on fire. The U.S. Army had the doctor test chemical warfare agents on the guys with substances that were said to be acutely toxic, incapacitating agents. Others were tested with scopolamine, aka the devil's breath, a mind-altering substance so powerful it said it can turn people into something like a zombie. It's been used in the past for witchcraft purposes and trippy magic ceremonies, and in Colombia for robberies, kidnapping, and assault. One guy named Joseph Smith later testified about the experiments in court. The doctors told him they were going to attach some gauze to him and that it was absolutely safe. They worked on his back a bit and applied the gauze. That caused a lot of pain, said Smith in court. At night, I would lay in my bed with my arm in the air, shaking it so it would ease the pain. He said some of the prisoners couldn't tolerate the pain, so they took off the patches, they stuck them to the wall, and they melted the paint. In another experiment, Smith got 3 injections every few hours for 3 months. It was a lot of effort, but he got $2 for every shot, which was serious money in the prison bank back in the 1960s. But every time he got the shots, the body part where the shot was administered to would expand. They never told him what they were injecting him with. Smith said the third experiment I was involved with was the Army LSD test. He wasn't told what it was. He said that he kind of blacked out. I don't remember eating during that time, he said. I know I wasn't right in my head. Like all the prisoners, Smith thought they were good guys because they wore lab coats. No one thought that doctors would deliberately hurt them. In 1969, while free, Smith's skin was discolored. Then his teeth fell out, like in a bad dream. He found he couldn't talk to people anymore. His mind had been fried. His eyesight went, which he now knows was because of the experiments they did with his eyes. Smith was the reason why some of the creams you now buy say keep away from your eyes, wash immediately if contact is made. Smith's mother took him to see a psychiatrist and he was diagnosed with schizophrenic schizoid characteristics. That was the LSD, which you'll hear more about soon. The final words for his testimony are, they should not have done what they did. From 1951 to 1974, under the sponsorship of those huge mega companies, thousands of prisoners became human guinea pigs. The prison was a huge lab. One of the guys that uncovered it walked in there in 1971, and at first he didn't know why the place looked so strange. He later said, "What I saw was scores of inmates whose bodies were covered with medical tape and bandages. I could see them on their arms, chests, shoulders, and back. It looked like there'd been a major gang war or a knife fight in the exercise yard or cell block." The prisoners told him that the money was too good to turn down. For a full day's work, they got maybe 50 cents, but letting doctors test stuff on them was sometimes worth hundreds of dollars over months. On top of that, they were told that doing the experiments would certainly help their cause when their parole hearing came around. No one got compensation, even though it was heard in court that these experiments were just as bad, if not worse than Tuskegee. It was said that Kligman had turned Holmesburg into the Kmart of human experimentation. Cow's blood. The Alliance for Human Research Protection explains that in 1942, a Harvard biochemist named Edward Cohn, working for the U.S. Navy, injected men with cow's blood. It said he injected 64 Massachusetts prisoners with cow blood during research on blood transfusions. He apparently did a lot of good work in this area, which was direly needed for the military since soldiers sometimes need transfusions after being injured in battle. Still, after his test with those men, he wrote, "The rejection of the blood was catastrophic. All the men died." That's one way of putting it. Another paper written about the experiment doesn't even mention death. It just says, "Unfortunately, the residual differences between cow and human blood proteins proved insurmountable, dooming the medical utility of the bovine protein for the casualties of war." These next prisoners didn't die, but man, they suffered in the name of science. Dr. Carl G. Heller. The big threat during the Cold War was nuclear weaponry and what high doses of radiation did to the body. That's why in the 1970s, the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission gave Dr. Carl G. Heller and Dr. C. Alvin $1.6 million. They said, let's see what radiation does to the male reproductive system. In the experiments, each prisoner was paid $5 for an initial blast of radiation, another $10 for each biopsy, usually 5 biopsies, and $100 when it was all over. The prisoners were told to lie face down with their scrotums in a little box filled with warm water. The box was connected to a set of X-ray tubes, and then came the blast. This all happened to prisoners in 1970 in Washington and 1973 in Oregon. But there were ethical problems. The guys weren't told anything in their informed consent forms about radiation poisoning. They weren't informed about the high chance that they'd get cancer. They just thought a couple of $100 for dangling your balls in a small pool of warm water was easy compared to the 25 cents a day they were getting in prison. About the missing details, Dr. Heller later said, "I didn't warn them of all the dangers because I didn't want to frighten them." What he did tell them, though, is that the whole point of the experiment was to sterilize them. He said they'd get all that money and a reduction in their sentence if they agreed to not be able to have any more kids. He said such kids would be radiation-induced mutants. Actually, out of the 650 or so prisoners that took the heavy dose, some went on to have children with serious birth defects. In April of 2001, a settlement was made for $1.5 million, which worked out to about $30,000 for every guy that had gotten their balls fried in Oregon. The guys in the Washington prison received $2.4 million in March 2000. This worked out at $100,000 to $150,000 per prisoner that was still living. Okay, now let's talk about something literally mind-blowing. MKUltra. Now we come to what we consider to be the most fascinating story of them all. The CIA's LSD mind control and psychological torture experiments, aka MKUltra. These stories are not just important when it comes to human rights and official secrecy, but they affected cultures all over the world in a very profound way. The CIA didn't know it at the time, but it changed history. Ironically, if it hadn't been for MKUltra, the Beatles would arguably never have grown their hair long and written all their best songs. In the USA, there'd be no Merry Pranksters, the Jimi Hendrix Experience, or no epoch-making concert in a field in Woodstock. LSD changed everything. One of the main reasons is people such as Ken Kesey, who wrote One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, were part of the experiments and took LSD out of the labs and into the streets, helping to create a cultural revolution that became a living nightmare for the CIA and the government in general. The CIA had vastly misunderstood LSD's psychedelic ability to open the mind, what Aldous Huxley called opening the doors of perception. The problem is when such drugs are given to you in huge doses and you don't know what they are, you think you lost your mind. These experiments went on for 20 years, from 1953 to 1973, and encompassed a myriad of unbelievable experiments. We imagine not many of you have heard of MKUltra's Operation Midnight Climax, in which the CIA paid prostitutes to lure customers back to CIA safe houses where the men were plied with LSD and other substances and then fed subliminal messages as the women asked them questions designed by the CIA. Agents would record all of this and then watch the sessions through one-way glass. The CIA even spiked government employees and their own biological warfare scientists, one of them named Frank Olson, who mysteriously flew out of the 10th floor window of the Hotel Statler in New York in 1953. Before that, Olson had seen the CIA do some very disturbing things to prisoners, and he didn't like what he saw. The death could well have been a murder. It happened only 10 days after the CIA agents had spiked his drink with what they considered a potential truth serum. He was one of few people that knew about the project, and just before he died, he had said to his wife, "I've made a terrible mistake." Olson was said to have been sensitive, not a characteristic you need when working for the sometimes psychopathic CIA. A report unearthed said this: Olson witnessed horrific, brutal interrogations on a regular basis. Detainees who were deemed expendable, suspected spies or moles, security leaks, etc., were literally interrogated to death in experimental methods combining drugs, hypnosis, and torture to attempt to master brainwashing techniques and memory erasing. The CIA thought he was going to pull the plug. Olson's colleague later said Frank Olson pulled no punches anytime. That's what they were scared of, I'm sure. Did they kill one of their own? Now we know a report was written about Olson and handed to CIA operatives after he'd seen horrific experiments in Germany. The report stated, Olson visited a CIA safe house near Stuttgart where he saw men dying, often in agony, from the weapons he had made. He was deeply disturbed over what he had seen in the CIA safe houses in Germany and displayed symptoms of not wanting to keep secret what he had witnessed. Not long after that, LSD was slipped into his drink and he ended up dead on a sidewalk. After investigating the case, a U.S. lawyer wrote, Frank Olson did not die because he was an experimental guinea pig who experienced a bad trip. He died because of concern that he would divulge information concerning a highly classified CIA interrogation program. A New York assistant district attorney said there was motive to kill him. He knew the deepest, darkest secrets of the Cold War. If they do that to their own people, what would they do to people they thought were scum? Soon, CIA agents were in prisons all over the U.S. telling prisoners to take a drink of their truth serum. They told the gangster Whitey Bulger that they were working on a way to cure schizophrenia. They gave him massive doses, which he later said made him think he had gone insane. Remember, at this point, not many people knew what LSD was. It was way before the hippies came on the scene. Bulger later said, I was in prison for committing a crime, but they committed a greater crime on me. He explained how things went down. I was in a cell and they brought in a doctor. He had a syringe and said, this is a new drug. We want to try it out on you. They shot me up with it and I was tripping for 2 days. It was a mind blower. He got 50 separate doses. He was still young at the time and not the violent man he would become. It was later said he didn't murder prior to LSD. His brain may have been altered. So how could you say he was really guilty? The CIA tried their hardest to destroy all documents about MKUltra, but they failed. People asked how this could happen in a democratic nation. In court, it was heard that Americans all over the mainland were probably walking around with severe physical and psychological damage thanks to the CIA. Admiral Stansfield Turner, who became the director of Central Intelligence, said at a hearing in 1977 that some of these prisoners were not given a choice. Turner said, "We also know that some unwitting testing took place on criminal sexual psychopaths confined at a state hospital. In 1956, they gave people a drug named bulbocapnine, something which kills cattle. Humans were given what the document said was fairly large doses, which led to catatonia or stupor. Documents showed the CIA wanted to evaluate the drug on convicts incarcerated at the deleted state penitentiary to see if they could make someone lose their memory or willpower. Other documents say under Operation Artichoke, part of MKUltra, they gave an imprisoned Soviet agent sodium pentothal, now part of lethal injections, and disoxin, speed, which they say blitzed the guy's mind, and an agent was able to convince him he was a trusted and beloved friend. They could have just given him MDMA and he'd have hugged his new friends too." All jokes aside, these were physically and psychologically dangerous experiments. A man named Harold Blower, who was given large doses of LSD at a New York State Psychiatric Institute in 1953, died right after he'd been injected with the drug. His last words were, "I don't feel so good. Something's wrong." LSD can't really kill you, but the shock can. His heart failed. The New York Times said that this man had reacted badly the first few times they dosed him, but they still kept going. In CIA reports, they actually called guys like this expendables. All this time, the CIA was trying to find out if they could wipe someone's mind and turn them into a robot agent. Let's remember that some people think Charles Manson was part of these experiments and he was under mind control, or the killers he sent to murder those people were. The well-reviewed book Chaos, Charles Manson, the CIA, and the Secret History of the 60s makes this scenario look very plausible. You might also not know that the Unabomber serial killer Ted Kaczynski was part of these experiments and was never the same after them. Then there were the experiments in Canada sponsored by the CIA through one of its many fronts. These experiments, according to one victim, stripped your soul. The CIA paid a wad of cash to the Canadian psychiatrist Donald Cameron. With CIA funding, he was able to take his research to a new level. He believed that people with mental health issues such as depression and anxiety could be reprogrammed, their minds wiped clean and then filled again with new thoughts. Of course, the CIA loved the sound of that. So they gave Cameron money and resources. Cameron took patients, often women with only minor depression, and gave them electroconvulsive therapy along with massive doses of LSD. He'd often keep them in a coma in what he called psychic driving experiments, playing their comatose minds the same recorded words over and over again, 24 hours a day for weeks on end, sometimes months. One former patient later explained the horrifying ordeal. She said, "He couldn't get his patients to listen to them enough, so he put speakers in football helmets and locked them on their heads. They were going crazy, banging their heads into walls, so he then figured he could put them in a drug-induced coma and play the tapes as long as he needed." One patient said she was kept in a coma for 18 days and the second time for 29 days. As soon as she woke up, he fried her brain with electric shocks, way more powerful than is standard in electroconvulsive therapy. As she was in a state of utter fear and confusion, he made her take LSD and other drugs. The woman's daughter said her mother was never the same when she came out of that hospital. She told the media, "They say it was torture for human beings, human torture. What they attempt to do is erase your emotions." Cameron believed, like Dr. Frankenstein, that he could make new people, what he called super citizens, and that was something the CIA wanted to get involved with. Cameron was convinced he could de-pattern the human mind, and from something damaged or broken, he could create something new. For that, the CIA made him a wealthy doctor. He got about $600,000 in today's money. The sad thing was, he is never punished for this. The CIA was never punished for 20 years of utter barbarity we would usually associate with Nazi Germany. As we've seen, the only people who ever get properly punished are the folks that leak such secrets and are called a threat to national security. The worrying question is, what experiments might be happening right now? Psychological warfare units still receive huge budgets. The CIA is just as secretive. Maybe you'll find out that one day you were part of the madness. Dying from diseases on the battlefield during World War II was a grim reality for many thousands of soldiers. The Germans, like the other warring nations, keenly understood the dangers of disease after World War I. So when they had human guinea pigs to test on in the Second War, they did so. And the story is horrifying. It's hard to say just how many soldiers died from various diseases during World War I. The numbers change depending on what resource you're reading. But anywhere you look, you'll see that disease was one of the leading causes of death. It's thought that death from disease, combining all nations' military personnel, numbered over 2 million. So, not surprisingly, this was a major concern of the Nazis during the war that followed. To lessen the number of disease fatalities, they worked on creating vaccines. As you know, in a normal world, vaccines go through rigorous testing before they're given to human populations at large. But the Nazis, believing their prisoners of war were entirely expendable, if not a plague to humanity in their twisted thesis regarding a superior race, they did not worry about their test subjects' well-being. We'll start with the disease malaria, which, as you know, is carried by that troublesome creature, the mosquito. After a person's bitten, they'll start to show symptoms after about 10 to 15 days. This usually means the onset of a terrible fever, headaches, and worse, coma followed by death. Even today, around 400,000 people die each year from malaria. From 1942 to 1945, the Nazis used prisoners at the Dachau concentration camp to try to understand how to treat malaria in their own troops. This involved giving a purposefully infected person drugs after infection and also testing prophylactics, meaning drugs given prior to infection. Prisoners were sometimes infected by the mosquitoes themselves. Other times, German doctors extracted the disease from the mucus glands of mosquitoes and injected it into the prisoners. One of the main people behind these experiments was a professor of tropical diseases named Klaus Schilling. He was a highly educated man, but not one, it seems, that had any scruples about infecting unwitting people with the disease. Prior to the outbreak of the Second World War, he'd taken part in a malaria immunization experiment on Italian inmates at a psychiatric hospital. So it's no surprise that during the war he came to the attention of the Nazis. Now let's take a look at testimony from the Nuremberg trials, after which Mr. Schilling experienced a bad end of the noose. During the trials, it was said that most of the malaria victims in the camps were Poles, Russians, and Yugoslavs. Here's a snippet of some of that testimony. Requests for prisoners were made by Schilling. One such request was admitted into evidence, stating that Polish prisoners were requested. A list of inmates were prepared in the camp physician's office, the inmates being of all nationalities which were represented in the camp. 1,200 prisoners were selected in total, and none of them had volunteered. In case you're wondering, sometimes inmates would volunteer for experiments because they'd been promised a reward. Unfortunately, they didn't always receive that reward. The testimony says that priests were often the chosen ones for these malaria experiments. The Nazis didn't only persecute Jews, they were also anti-Christian, a religion, according to one scholar, that Hitler said was only fit for slaves. One of the test subjects was named Father Koch. He explained that in the camp he was told to put his hands inside a box. That box was full of mosquitoes. He had to do that every day for a period of 7 days. At the trials, it was explained every afternoon another box of mosquitoes was put between his legs while he was in bed. Each morning a blood smear was taken from his ear and his temperature was measured each day and night. He was also given the drug quinine, which today is still used to treat malaria. Father Koch contracted malaria, and after being released from the hospital, he suffered from a high fever and pain in his joints. He was one of the lucky ones that survived his bout with the deadly disease. Others were not so fortunate. Trial testimony stated others were given neosalvarsan, pyramine antipyrin, and a drug numbered 92516, and several combinations of these. Some people died as a result of the experiments. Dr. Schilling was present at the autopsy when there was a death. It was then that he understood the patients had not been able to withstand such large doses of the drugs. According to testimony, death from a neosalvarsan overdose was similar to death from arsenic poisoning. People who had been given high doses of a dangerous drug called pyramidin also died. This drug was used to lower a test subject's temperature. 2 young Russian guys were given it after being infected with malaria, and they were dead soon after. The cause of death was the disintegration of blood corpuscles. We won't get into that, but suffice to say it does not sound very nice. Of course, some people just died from malaria itself. The number was said to be 30, although another 300 or 400 people died from complications due to malaria. We know from the same testimony that there was a typhus outbreak at the camp. The drugs administered to the patients suffering from this were neosalvarsan, atabrine, and quinine. During the trials, Schilling denied that he knew about the beatings of prisoners, stating he thought he was doing work for the good of humanity. In fact, one woman who'd worked for him for 30 years testified that his intentions at Dachau were good. Other witnesses talked about how professional he was. Still, he went to the gallows. Dr. Schilling should have known better, was the verdict. Here's how one judge explained it. Being educated and a learned person that he was, Schilling undoubtedly must have realized the manner in which his work suited the needs of the Nazis. Although his personal motives may have stemmed from his desire to aid humanity, he permitted himself to utilize Nazi methods in contrast to other eminent German artists and scientists who either fled or refused to make themselves part of the Nazi system. Okay, now let's move to typhus. In the book, Murderous Medicine, Nazi Doctors, Human Experimentation, and Typhus, it's explained that the Nazis created Jewish ghettos partly under the fabrication that they were trying to contain a typhus epidemic and stop it from reaching the wider public. It was really just an excuse to quarantine a number of people they believed were a threat to their so-called fatherland. Once the Jewish people were removed from the ghettos and sent to the camps, many of them were told they were going to receive a delousing bath, yet the bath was actually the gas chamber. It was also stated in the book that the Nazis kept Jewish people in contained areas because the doctors favored overcrowded and unsanitary conditions to permit the epidemic to flourish, killing as many people as possible. Typhus is a terrible way to die, too, usually starting with a high fever and later bringing on a state of psychosis. Still, not only Jewish people died from typhus. The disease, which is spread by lice or fleas, terrified the Nazis. Scholars have since pointed out that the Nazis looked at the disease just as they looked at the Jews, whom they saw as a parasite on their country, just as the lice were a parasite on humans. Many Nazi troops were dying in numbers from typhus on the Eastern Front, and so they needed a vaccination. They also needed people to test it on. On top of that, dealing with disease-carrying microscopic creatures is a dangerous job, so the Nazis again needed to enlist expendable volunteers. Some people did actually volunteer for this, but only because the alternative was likely the gas chamber and incinerator. One of the men responsible for making that vaccine was the bacteriologist and head of the SS Hygiene Institute in Berlin, Joachim Murogowski. He already knew that a successful vaccine had been made by the Polish biologist Rudolf Weigel, but that involved using the typhus germ taken from lice intestines. The Nazis didn't want to invite millions of lice into a camp, so a workaround was needed. Weigel, by the way, ended up saving thousands of Jewish lives with his vaccine. Rabbits were a better choice than lice when it came to experimentation, thanks to a French scientist named Paul Giraud. It was discovered that typhus bacteria could be grown in the lungs of rabbits as long as the rabbits had a very weakened immune system. The bacteria that were grown could then be used in the vaccine. Murogowski wrote in a memo, "This vaccine has been tested among concentration camp inmates with excellent results. Still, making vaccines is serious business. Even the French experts had a hard time making it. Never mind Nazi scientists who were working with prisoners from all walks of life. According to an article in Politico, some of the prisoners who worked on the bacterium included a baker and a gym coach. Another guy worked in politics, so they were hardly suited to make life-saving vaccines. The typhus bacteria only lived in lice and humans, so getting it into rabbits was a problem. In short, blood from an infected person was injected into guinea pigs, real ones. Their infected brains or testes were mashed up, and the infected liquid produced went into mice. Liquid from their mashed up lungs was subsequently injected into those poor bunny rabbits. But remember, the rabbits had to be immunocompromised. That was the only way the bacteria could survive. Making the rabbits' immune systems impaired took a number of steps, but it was basically involving frightening the life out of them. Dunking them in freezing cold water after they'd been shaved seemed to do the trick. In the end, two types of vaccines were made, one that worked and one that didn't work. It seems that one that didn't work ended up being injected into the arms of many German soldiers on the front line. The Nazi scientists nor the soldiers knew it didn't work, of course. It also didn't work for people in the camps, although the good vaccine was used for those forced to work at the camp. During the trial of Murogowski after the war, it was stated that typhus was just one disease of many that the Nazis experimented with. Other diseases included cholera, yellow fever, psittacosis, plague, smallpox, and typhoid. The testimonies that cover these experiments are hundreds of pages long. With the gist of much of what was said is humans were injected with those diseases. They were given drugs to cure them, and if the drugs didn't work, the disease often killed the people. The Nazis also conducted experiments involving what was referred to as infectious jaundice, which is the hepatitis virus. These experiments used mainly Polish prisoners at the Sachsenhausen and Natzweiler concentration camps and were conducted between June 1943 and January 1945. Hermann Becker Freising was one of the people involved, although details on what he actually did are scant. Years later, he actually ended up working for the United States on the space medicine program. Kurt Blom was another man who went over to the US, even though he was obviously guilty of a number of heinous crimes. He worked on some top-secret projects in the US, which is the reason he was spared a lengthy prison sentence or the gallows. More than 300 Nazi scientists were scooped up by the US. The mindset was good minds shouldn't go to waste. In the camps, Blum conducted experiments involving the artificial mass transmission of the malaria parasite to humans. He also infected prisoners with the hepatitis and bubonic plague. At the Nuremberg trials, one witness said, he was there when prisoners carrying the hepatitis virus were experimented on. He talked about seeing doctors giving patients liver punctures, although he didn't explain exactly what they were for. He was likely referring to liver biopsies, a procedure that these days people receive local anesthetic for. When asked if he thought the patient suffered, he replied, "Here we are concerned with an operation which only lasts for a few seconds, but judging from the demeanor of the patient, we could see that we weren't concerned with any trifles. This operation must have been painful." On page 733 of one transcript, it stated experimental subjects were deliberately infected with epidemic jaundice, some of whom have died as a result, and others were caused great pain and suffering. We could go on about epidemic jaundice, but the stories are much the same. As for the plague, Mr. Blom was attempting to weaponize it. Part of his work involved handling the plague, such as you have to do if you're going to turn it into a weapon. As you know, this is called biological warfare. It was Blum's specialty, hence his being hired by the US and evading the noose. Hitler, by the way, was against the use of biological weapons. Blum also worked in developing the plague vaccines, and for that he required test subjects. It said he introduced the plague as well as tuberculosis to thousands of prisoners. One resource states that the US withheld incriminating evidence that demonstrated his role as a supervisor of such horrific experiments. And that's why we can't tell you much about his plague experiments. In World War II, the Third Reich committed some of the most horrific atrocities imaginable in the name of medical advancement, intentionally infecting prisoners with nightmarish diseases like syphilis, skinning people's backs and applying caustic chemicals to the exposed flesh, and even infusing their bodies with animal testicles. These Nazi scientists… it appears we've made a mistake. These were actually all experiments performed by US scientists over the course of the 20th century. That's right, while it isn't common knowledge, when it comes to unethical human experiments, the United States has a lot of terrifying skeletons in its closet. Let's shine a light on America's dark scientific history and take a look at some of the terrifying experiments performed on prisoners, the sick, and the disabled, often without their knowledge or informed consent. Our depressing tale begins 105 years ago back in 1915 with a man named Dr. Joseph Goldberger. The Hungarian-born doctor is called the unsung hero of epidemiology by some, and is well known for establishing the link between poverty and health problems. The good doctor studied a disease called pellagra, which had a scary array of symptoms, from open sores on the skin to dementia. While most doctors at the time believed pellagra to be bacterial, Dr. Goldberger instead proved that the disease is dietary, primarily caused by a lack of vitamin B3. While this was an incredibly important medical discovery, he actually discovered this through performing experiments on prisoners in a Mississippi jail. Dr. Goldberger collaborated with Earl Brewer, the state governor, to perform dietary experiments on 11 prisoners in exchange for their freedom. After 5 months of a selectively restricted diet, these prisoners did indeed experience pellagra rashes, proving Goldberger's theory. Then we skip ahead 5 years to 1920. Meet Dr. Leo L. Stanley, the resident physician of San Quentin Prison and a terrifying medical maniac. Dr. Stanley performed over 10,000 human experiments during his tenure at the prison, and some of the details of those experiments are nothing short of disgusting. Dr. Stanley transplanted animal testicles into human subjects in order to boost their virility. It did not, and also performed countless human-to-human testicle transplants. Like fellow medical monster Joseph Mengele, Dr. Stanley was an avowed racist and eugenicist, and a great believer in the forced sterilization of undesirables. Now, it really shouldn't be surprising that a doctor who implants animal sex glands in people is a man of low moral character. An even more upsetting fact is that the American eugenics movement was not exactly niche either, and many proponents, including Dr. Stanley himself, maintained their beliefs in the project long after the Nazi atrocities became common knowledge. Luckily for the US prison population, the wildly unethical experiments of America's mad doctors slowed down for the next 20 years. But in the 1940s, the epidemic of unethical human experiments came back in full force. Dr. Jonas Salk is perhaps best known for creating the first effective vaccine against polio, which was approved for general use in 1955. However, what you probably don't know about is the unethical human experiment he conducted in an Ypsilanti, Michigan insane asylum in 1942. These experiments were performed on extremely vulnerable patients who weren't fully aware of what they were getting into, even described as senile and debilitated by newspapers at the time. Dr. Salk and his partners tested an experimental influenza vaccine on the asylum's patients and exposed them to the flu a few months later. Depressingly, a major roadblock in the experiment was the fact that the patients often weren't mentally competent enough to describe their experiences with symptoms. You'll find a lot of the following U.S. human experiments shared an unsettling common factor: knowingly infecting confined prisoners with dangerous bacteria and viruses. 3 more terrifying human experiments stood out among the crowd during the 1940s. The U.S. government funded studies into the causes and effects of hepatitis on the human body, conducted by Dr. W. Paul Havens, Jr. 2 of these studies were conducted in mental asylums in Norwich and Middleton, Connecticut. Patients in both asylums were knowingly exposed to hepatitis. The names of the specific patients in the study have been lost to time, and even worse, these studies apparently didn't even uncover any particularly useful results. A few years later, an utterly disgusting study into a lethal stomach bug was conducted at the New York State Vocational Institution. For clarity, while that might sound like a community college, it was actually a state prison in West Coxsackie. The scientists involved in the study were interested in finding out whether the disease spread more effectively through germs in the air or by swallowing infectious material. How did they test this? They made their imprisoned subjects swallow unfiltered stool samples. Yeah, that's right. They made the prisoners ingest infected feces to test the infectiousness of a deadly stomach bug. It was never written down whether the prisoners were given any kind of reward for this vile experiment, but our money would be on the no there. The 1940s continued its shameful streak of human rights abuses with a particularly inhumane experiment performed by the University of Minnesota on a group of 11 public service employee volunteers, many of which were conscientious objectors to World War II, such as pacifists and Quakers. They were injected with highly contagious malaria and starved for a period of 5 days. In an experiment now known as the Minnesota Starvation Experiment, some of those volunteers were even forced to perform hard labor, many of them losing around 14 pounds over the course of the study. The purpose of this twisted experiment was to help experts in figuring out how to treat victims of mass starvation who were piling up in the millions over in Europe. As the 1940s drew to a close with Hitler defeated and World War II finally coming to an end, the 1946 Guatemala syphilis experiment began. This incident came to light from unclassified documents in 2010, horrifying the American public with its gruesome details and implications. The experiment was classified and hidden for decades, both for its clear breaches of ethics and human decency, and the fact that it resulted in no valuable information whatsoever. To give this experiment some brief background, syphilis was creating huge problems for the American military. According to some sources in 1943, syphilis and gonorrhea were costing the military 7 million working days. What's more, the sheer volume of infections among military personnel was costing the Army $34 million every year in treatment. A treatment, by the way, that wasn't even really that effective in treating these debilitating sexual disorders. The U.S. Army needed to find out a lot more about the disease. What is it? How does it spread? And how do we treat it? This was the impetus behind the horrifying Guatemala syphilis experiments. Dr. John Charles Cutler spearheaded the early days of experimentation in Guatemala as part of a diplomatic envoy between the United States and Guatemala's newly elected democratic government. He based this study on an earlier experiment he took part in, a prison study on gonorrhea in Terre Haute, Indiana, that involved intentionally infecting prisoners. The Guatemala study, though, was on a much larger scale. The study intentionally exposed over 1,300 people to syphilis, gonorrhea, and cancroid. This group included Guatemalan soldiers, mental patients, sex workers, and criminals. The sample ranged from age 10 to age 72. Many of the subjects, especially the younger ones, did not fully understand the implications of what was happening to them. Therefore, they couldn't properly consent either. But this didn't much bother Dr. Cutler, who tried his hardest to keep the whole experiment under wraps. The methods of inoculation for many of the patients were equally strange and uncomfortable. Sex workers were infected with syphilis through their cervix. Prisoners were either injected or made to have sex with these infected sex workers. Mental patients, however, got the worst of it all. Their methods of infection included injection, abrasions to the penis, ingestion, or cisternal puncture. In case you're lucky enough to be unfamiliar with the concept of a cisternal puncture, Encyclopedia Britannica describes it as the insertion of a needle below the occipital bone at the back of the skull to access cerebral spinal fluid. If that's not enough to make your skin crawl, I don't know what is. The experiment progressed without people's knowledge for some time. While the period of active inoculation was concluded by 1948, the subjects were observed until 1953. Cutler and his co-researchers hoped to discover more information on the effectiveness of penicillin as a treatment for sexually transmitted diseases. Instead, they just discovered the bottom of the barrel of ethically dubious experimentation. When information about the experiment became public in late 2010, 7 years after Cutler's death, the details were seen as so egregious that President Barack Obama called Guatemalan President Alvaro Colom to issue an apology on behalf of the American government. Then Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and Secretary of Health and Human Services Kathleen Sebelius also issued apologies for Cutler's experiment. Shockingly, the Guatemala syphilis experiment won't even be the last nasty human experiment Dr. Cutler was a part of, but we'll get to that one later. This brings us to the 1950s, which, like the decade before it, had no shortage of nightmarish human experiments performed by the U.S. government. 23 inmates at the Patuxent prison in Jessup, Maryland were intentionally infected with Asian flu as a control group in testing an experimental vaccine. Another experiment at a federal penitentiary in Atlanta involved infecting prison inmates with gonorrhea by pumping the bacteria directly into the urinary tract via the penis. It's hard to believe those nightmares were going on in the era famous for family values, white picket fences, and I Love Lucy. As the tree-hugging, free-loving flower power era of the 60s was beginning, things weren't getting any better. Around half the U.S. states had made experimenting on prisoners completely legal, and rising pharmaceutical giants were more than ready to take advantage of those lucrative human guinea pigs. In 1963, debilitated 19-year-old patients at a Jewish chronic disease hospital in Brooklyn were secretly injected with cancer cells. This, understandably, caused a public uproar and led to tightening medical consent laws. If you think this is the lowest we can sink, I'm sorry to disappoint you. It gets worse. From 1963 to 1966, experiments were conducted on mentally disabled children on Staten Island at the Willowbrook State School. The children were orally infected with hepatitis in order to test whether gamma globulin, a protein fraction capable of forming antibodies, was able to cure it. This was one of the most controversial U.S. human experiments of all time, until the reveal of another experiment in 1972. The Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment. If that name sounds familiar, it's because Dr. Cutler, architect of the Guatemala Syphilis Experiment, was also involved. The study's official name was Tuskegee Study of Untreated Syphilis in the Negro Male, because the study was specifically aimed at African American men with syphilis in Macon County, Alabama, and run by the Tuskegee Institute. It tracked several hundred of these men, never informing them that they had syphilis and denying them any kind of proper treatment in order to track the progression of the disease. The experiment went on through to many of the subjects' deaths. Human experiments performed by the U.S. government thankfully dwindle after this, but there are a couple more horrifying examples, largely because human testing was still cheaper than testing on chimps. In the early 1970s, Edward Youssef Anthony, an inmate of Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia, had a truly harrowing experience. According to Anthony, he had a layer of skin peeled from his back and corrosive chemicals applied to the flesh underneath in order to test a drug being developed at the time. When new legislation turfed government scientists and pharmaceutical research divisions out of U.S. prisons, they returned once again to developing countries. In one particularly egregious example, U.S. pharmaceutical corporation Pfizer Inc. tested the volatile antibiotic Trovan on scores of Nigerian children. The tests left 11 children dead, many disabled, and resulted in a hefty out-of-court settlement between Pfizer and the Nigerian people. In spite of settling, Pfizer never officially claimed any responsibility for the damage to their innocent test subjects. As of 2008, 40 to 65% of medical testing for federally regulated medical products was done outside of the United States, a number that has likely grown since. According to the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services, less than 1% of this testing is inspected by U.S. regulators. Whether more horrifying human experiments are being performed by American researchers in different countries today is a question we may never have the answer to. But everything we've learned today sadly doesn't give us much faith in that answer being no. All I saw before me were acres of skin. It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time. If you saw part 1 of the show, you'll have heard those words. They were spoken by a doctor who entered a prison in the USA loaded with chemicals to test on humans. Imagine that. You've been punished, are serving time, and then you're punished again because someone has been given the green light to use your skin as a testing surface. Much of the time when such prisoners are used in testing, they agree to do it. But often in the past, what they weren't told is exactly what was being tested and the possible dangers involved. Let's now have a look at how this was done. It's ancient history. We're going to start with a man that's sometimes called the father of anatomy. That's a compliment, of course, but his ways could have been said to have been rather unethical. We're talking about a Greek physician called Herophilus of Chalcedon. We're told that this physician did occasionally use dead people for his work in understanding the human anatomy, but that didn't always happen. The website ResearchGate tells us that in ancient Greece and ancient Egypt, looking under the hood of dead folks was plain taboo, but this physician did do it and educated Greece on anatomy like no one had done before. But he also performed what are called live vivisections, which basically means opening up a person while they're well and truly aware of it. A Greek encyclopedist known as Celsus wrote in a 2nd century medical book that Herophilus used around 600 live prisoners for his research. His work was groundbreaking, as we said, and he was a gift to medical science. But as one scientific paper asks, was he a butcher or an innovator? In this paper, Celsus is quoted as saying, Herophilus and Erasistatrus did this in the best way by far. When they laid open men whilst alive, criminals received out of prison from the kings, and whilst these were still breathing, observed parts which beforehand nature had concealed. According to that thesis, this was a kind of execution, but still one that many people at the time thought was very cruel. No kidding. Radiation experiments. If you read the book The Plutonium Files, you can find many examples of when the USA tested dangerous levels of plutonium on American citizens. The US and other countries were trying to develop the atomic bomb, and no one was exactly sure what high levels of radiation would do to a person. Some of these people were patients in hospitals, and some were prisoners. Sometimes they were just sick children, and on one occasion, pregnant women were chosen. In Massachusetts, it's said that 57 kids, many who were mentally retarded, were given oatmeal poisoned with radioactive tracers, and that was conducted by MIT and sponsored by the Quaker Oats Company. This was well after the development of the atomic bomb, and it was all about proving the nutrients in the oatmeal. It sounds like fake news, but it's not. The Smithsonian wrote that these boys were already maltreated and so seen as kids that didn't matter, adding, as part of the study, the boys were fed oatmeal and milk laced with radioactive iron and calcium. In another experiment, scientists directly injected the boys with radioactive calcium. These kids weren't exactly prisoners, but they were in the care of the authorities and didn't have any say in the matter. That same article mentions a few instances when mentally handicapped kids, kids in institutions, minorities, were tested on and given all kinds of ailments. Back to radiation. In all, you can read about hundreds, maybe thousands of people that were made very sick as American scientists tried to figure out how the body dealt with radiation. All these experiments remained top secret until the 90s, when President Bill Clinton said, "It's time we talked about radiation experiment cover-ups." The plague in the Philippines. During the Second World War, the Japanese were trying to figure out how to drop diseases on the USA. But before this time, the US was trying to figure out how to treat major diseases. It's said that while in the Philippines, the US Army, along with scientists, purposely gave 5 prisoners the bubonic plague and caused something called beriberi in another 29 prisoners. 4 of these people died. According to the book, When Doctors Kill, Who, Why, and How, they did this not to try and spread disease, but just to better understand it. That book also says that one particular Harvard professor over there gave other Filipino prisoners cholera. The book says all became very sick and 13 people died. Thankfully, these experiments were investigated and they were called highly unethical. In the book, it's also written that during the Nuremberg trials, Nazi doctors who had done a lot of awful stuff themselves tried to justify their work by using the American scientists in the Philippines as an example of similar malpractice. Torture. We should say here that we haven't purposefully picked out the USA, and no doubt awful experiments have been done elsewhere. It's just that there's a lot of literature available on what the USA has done. We can take torture for example, and as you probably know, many prisoners in the US have been given mind-altering drugs that has had very negative consequences. One of the most famous experiments was at Holmesburg Prison, and it took place with 320 inmates from 1964 to 1968. This is the same prison where that doctor talked about acres of skin. Prisoners there were also subjects for radiation experiments, but the torture experiment we're talking about involved incredibly powerful hallucinogens. The scientists wanted to know how much they could give a person, so they were completely useless. They tested hundreds of people. One person later said of this prison that had become well known for human guinea pigs. He had a dozen or two experiments going on at one time. He turned Holmesburg into the Kmart of human experimentation. It was a real industry. He was talking about the head doctor there. The doctor later told the press that he did everything according to what was asked of him and followed protocol. Even before the place became a giant lab, it was terrible. In 1938, a bunch of prisoners on hunger strike were sent to what were called bake ovens for punishment. It said 4 prisoners roasted to death. But you don't have to go that far back to see how prisoners have been used so the CIA could figure out the effects of torture. When the CIA just a few years back had prisoners holed up at black sites, it wasn't just torturing people to get information. According to a paper written by the Physicians for Human Rights, waterboarding and sleep deprivation and all manner of other tortures were merely tested on prisoners to see how they might best work. How else would they know? They needed living, breathing subjects, and human rights didn't seem to be an issue. Companies were brought in to what the report says was to calibrate the level of pain experienced by detainees during interrogation. The CIA denied this, and the government didn't investigate the matter. Then in 2010, the authorities wanted to know just how effective its active denial system was. This is a powerful laser that can hit a person's body, say people in a riot or a protest, and heat them up. It was first made, though, for war. It was decided that prisoners at Pitchess Detention Center in Los Angeles could be the guinea pigs for the laser. The ray is said to cause intense heat and pain, but when taken off the body, everything goes back to normal. It's also said, though, that there's potential for death, and there might even be some terrible long-term effects, such as eye damage if it gets you there, or even more of a chance of developing cancer. We should add that while this prison took the laser as an experimental trial, it did that to use on people only if they got out of hand. Mutants. Welcome Dr. Karl Heller. This man's experiments were said by one person to have a bit of the Buchenwald touch, meaning they were not unlike some of the Nazi experiments on humans in concentration camps, but this happened in the US. According to Gizmodo, he did the experiments on behalf of the Atomic Energy Commission. He basically radiated the prisoners, but to the extreme. Yeah, that's right, and he told these prisoners from Oregon and Washington that he had to sterilize them after the radiation so they would not contaminate the world with kids. But what he really said was that he was preventing them from passing on what he called radiation-induced mutants. He did in fact sterilize them, but a few of those guys later sued the government. The experiments went on from 1963 to 1973, and each got around $5 for losing the ability to make children, and also got blasted with radiation. There were other similar experiments performed on mostly poor black people, but they were often people suffering from cancer, so not prisoners. What would happen is they would sign up for a trial in which doctors said they were testing radiation and it might cure them of their cancer. This was a lie. What was actually happening is the US government was trying to see what happens to the body when hit by extremely high levels of radiation, far higher than anyone would receive now from radiation therapy. Cow blood. The rejection of the blood was catastrophic. This is what one scientific paper says about this particular study, in which 64 Massachusetts prisoners were injected with cow blood in 1942 after the US Navy had asked for it. Why, oh why, you might be thinking right now. Well, all in the name of science. The same as when 400 inmates at Stateville Correctional Center in Illinois were injected with malaria, and the same year 200 female prisoners were given viral hepatitis, or prisoners injected with cancer cells without their consent in the 50s by the renowned oncologist Chester Milton Southam, or as one book says, the long list of prisoners given potentially fatal diseases in the USA in those days. As for the cow's blood, we're told that a Harvard University scientist was asked by the Navy to create a powerful biological weapon. Well, one source says this, but another says it was to purify the process of extracting albumin from blood plasma in order to make better drugs. It's actually quite hard to find information about this, but some sources say the catastrophic events we mentioned ended with the death of 64 prisoners. We found another paper that said this: 2 prisoners at the Norfolk County Jail died of serum sickness induced by the infusions of crystalline bovine albumin. Harvard medical students were admitted to the Peter Bent Brigham Hospital and bled until they went into shock. Whatever the case, everyone agrees on catastrophic. If we extended this show to include more experiments performed on minorities, poor kids, mentally handicapped kids, sick people, pregnant women, mentally ill people, we could have gone on and on.
The United States has the largest prison population per capita in the world behind the Seychelles, but in terms of inmates, the tiny island nation has nothing on the US. According to prison policy, in total, if you include all the various forms of detention such as prisons, jails, juvenile correctional facilities, and more, there are currently about 2.3 million Americans behind bars. Violence, property crimes, drugs, and public order offenses are why most of those prisoners are doing time. What goes on in US prisons is also a matter of ongoing controversy, often depicted in movies and documentaries, but the atrocities of the past in those prisons, and prisons all over the world, are even more shocking. That's what we'll look at today in this episode of the Infographic Show, Worst Prison Experiments Conducted on Humans. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button so that you can be part of our notification squad. Perhaps the worst of all nightmares is being surgically experimented on by a ruthless physician. Such a narrative has been a mainstay in sci-fi and horror fiction for some time, with recent examples being Deadpool and before that the Human Centipede. These ideas didn't come out of nowhere. Indeed, we might look back at an American doctor and eugenicist called Leo Stanley. He was the chief surgeon at California's San Quentin State Prison from 1913 to 1951. As a believer in eugenics, the principle that we can be improved by controlled breeding and modifying the body, he started off at the prison by sterilizing all the men he considered beyond redemption. That was the least of it. He also believed he could make an old prisoner more virile by implanting the testicles of young men that had been executed into older inmates. It didn't really work, but he carried on. Only with not enough dead men's nuts, he turned to using the glands of rams, boars, and goats on thousands of inmates. Such surgical experiments might make us wince, but far worse was done with disease. One such case started in 1956 and went on for 14 years, during which researchers took mentally disabled children from Willowbrook State School in Staten Island, New York, and purposely gave them viral hepatitis. The kids were given food contaminated with the feces of infected persons, which the doctors had told parents amounted to a vaccination. This wasn't true, and the case goes down as an immoral experiment to find a treatment for the disease. While this is not strictly a prison experiment, the children were for all intents and purposes in detention. If not for medical science, then prisoners have been used in military experiments. One such experiment happened over a period of 20 years in the 1950s and 70s at the now infamous and closed down Holmesburg Prison in Philadelphia. The prison became notorious for its perfume experiments, a name the prisoners gave the experiments, but was also known for mind control experiments. Using mostly black prisoners, scientists at the University of Pennsylvania, working with the Dow Chemical Company, the US Army, and Johnson & Johnson, performed a series of tests by injecting them with powerful toxic chemicals in order to see how the skin reacts to them. Toxins were also added to prisoners' toothpaste, deodorant, shampoo, skin creams, and other products. Many of the prisoners became very sick, and many had painful and horrific looking skin conditions. It's thought 9 out of 10 prisoners were tested on. One of the chilling facts from this time is what the leading scientist said when he first walked into the prison and realized how perfect it would be for testing. "All I saw before me were acres of skin. It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time," he said. If that wasn't bad enough, many inmates were also given LSD in mind control experiments. One of these psychological experiments involved a substance known as EA3167. The drug, used in chemical warfare, is said to cause delirium and other psychotic behavior lasting from 3 to 4 days with subsequent amnesia. While it's thought such methods are on their way out, former detainees of the USA's notorious detention center at Guantanamo Bay have reported that they too were experimented on with mind-altering drugs. We will now turn our focus away from the USA and towards Germany. Detailing Nazi atrocities would be a show in itself, so we will talk about perhaps the worst of the worst first regarding experiments performed on prisoners in concentration camps. Again, it is the surgical experiments that make the skin crawl the most. Some of these were conducted by Nazi scientist Joseph Mengele, who it is said during 1943 and 1944 performed experiments on almost 1,500 twins in the camps. Twins were initially saved from the gas chamber so the doctor could conduct his tests in the name of eugenics. Stories differ on what he actually did, but according to the BBC, he would sometimes take out organs without anesthetic. The BBC also wrote that he had a collection of human eyes of all different colors stuck to his laboratory wall. He was fascinated with eye color, and it said he would inject dye into children's eyes to change the color. Adding to the horror and mystery behind the strange case of Dr. Mengele, whom, according to some surviving twins, had a fatherly side to him, there is one story that says he sewed two gypsy twins together to make them conjoined. They later died of gangrene, it was reported, after spending 3 days in terrible agony. Some prisoners were said to have bone, muscle, and nerve transplantation performed on them without anesthesia. The Nazis also conducted all kinds of other experiments, including freezing prisoners to study hypothermia, infecting them with diseases, poisoning them, and burning them alive. Japan also has a dark past involving its treatment of prisoners of war. Many of the worst atrocities were carried out on American POWs, something which has been told in all its lurid detail. In one such article, The Guardian explains that US prisoners were injected with seawater. One man had his lung removed and another man had his head drilled into so doctors could take out some of his brain in an effort to better understand epilepsy. It's also reported that one of the soldiers had his liver removed for it later to become dinner for Japanese soldiers. The charge of cannibalism to the Japanese soldiers was never brought, though, due to a lack of evidence. According to a Japanese man who was a medical student at the camp, the experiments had no medical value. They were being used to inflict as cruel a death as possible on the prisoners, said the man. The Japanese Imperial Army's penchant for torture didn't stop in Japan. A research and development center located in China known as Unit 731 was the place where Chinese POWs would experience a kind of hell on earth. It's now believed that thousands of POWs experienced live vivisection without anesthesia. Not only soldiers, but local women and children had their organs removed in the name of science. Most would die. It's said that other prisoners had their limbs removed so the Japanese could study blood loss, and sometimes the doctors would attempt to attach the limbs to the opposite side. The list of cruelties is a long one, and it's thought thousands of civilians died in the end, many of whom had been purposely infected with a number of diseases. Other prisoners were killed when the Japanese were merely testing how well their guns, bombs, and flamethrowers worked. Over to Russia and life in the Gulag, the Russian prison for so-called enemies of the people. One of a number of horrible ways to die in the Gulag was to have poisons tested on you. It's reported that a famous doctor used scores of patients while testing deadly poisons at the Gulag's Laboratory 12, aka the Chamber. Head of the lab, Grigory Myronovsky, was looking for a poison that was tasteless but could kill a man in seconds. It's reported that many of the victims of the chamber were previously well-respected academics, politicians, and artists.
The year is 1945 and the war to save Europe is over. The victorious Allies have crushed the Nazi war machine, and as the secrets of the Reich are leaked to the world, stories of the horrible atrocities they committed on Jews, homosexuals, people with intellectual disabilities, and prisoners of war lay bare the true horror that was the Third Reich. Yet in the shadow of Nazi atrocities, the British intelligence services would set up a camp whose human rights violations would mirror many of those committed by the Nazis, a horrendous interrogation camp that turned men into living skeletons. In an interview in the early 2000s, surviving German citizens spoke of August 1st, 1945, the day that the British arrived at the small resort town of Bad Nendorf. The town had until then been occupied by what the Germans called easygoing American infantrymen. But with the arrival of the British, the Americans left. The British troops gave the orders to every civilian to be ready to evacuate the town in 90 minutes, leaving people with little time to gather what precious few possessions they still had after the long war. Many initially thought that the move was temporary and that they would soon be allowed to return home. But as the British troops began to put up barbed wire and tear out the fancy baths from the town's bathhouse, the realization that their former home was being turned into something else soon hit them. There would be no returning home, at least not for years to come. The British strung up barbed wire throughout the town center and tore out the doors to each of the bathhouse's cubicles, replacing them with large steel doors so as to turn them into cells. Even before the town had been evacuated fully, the first truckloads of prisoners had already begun arriving. Initially, most of the prisoners were former Nazi Party members or members of the much-hated SS, all rounded up so as to thwart any possibility of a Nazi insurgency in the rebuilding of post-war Germany. Many, however, were leading industrialists of the Nazi regime. tobacco importers, oil company bosses, and forestry owners who had benefited greatly from Hitler's rule. However, as the months passed, the prison population quickly grew to include a large number of suspected Soviet agents. As Germany was partitioned between East and West, and the first chills of the Cold War descended on Europe, many officers of the NKVD, the Soviet secret police, were captured on spy missions and imprisoned in the camp. However, the anti-Soviet paranoia had also swept up a large number of German leftists and communist sympathizers. Others were simply German citizens who lived in the Russian zone and had been captured crossing the line. Some of these had come across offering to spy on Russians and were imprisoned on suspicion of being double agents. Others were normal people caught up in the great power struggle. One man who starved to death, Franz Osterreicher, had been arrested with forged papers while attempting to enter the British zone. His motivation? To find and be reunited with his gay lover. Another man, Walter Bergman, had offered to spy for the British, but because he spoke fluent Russian, he fell under suspicion and was imprisoned and tortured in an attempt to establish that he was a genuine defector. Bergman would die of starvation and lack of medical care. Yet, other prisoners were locked up for no good reason at all. One prisoner who was a former diplomat remained locked up simply because during his incarceration, he had learned too much about British interrogation methods. Fearing he would leave the camp and report on British methods to either the press or the Soviet intelligence services, the British decided instead to keep him locked up. Another person who was kept prisoner for 8 months had arrived there due to nothing more than a simple clerical error. A British inspector from Scotland Yard, Tom Hayward, would later be assigned to determine what exactly went down in this prison camp while being run by British intelligence, and his notes would go on to say that of the prisoners, there are a number against whom no offense has been alleged, and the only authority for their detention would appear to be that they are citizens of a country still nominally at war with us. Hayward's investigation would spill the secrets of Britain's most infamous prison camp and of its staggering human rights abuses. Observers noted that in his report to the government, anger and revulsion leapt from every page as he detailed the place where prisoners had been systematically beaten and exposed to extreme cold, starved to death, and tortured with instruments that the British intelligence officers had recovered from a Gestapo prison in Hamburg. During the British occupation, it was said that if you snuck up to the barbed wire fence at night, you could hear the screams of the prisoners inside. Others, however, say that the camp was the most sinister place on earth, precisely because of its dead silence, with one witness saying, "You never ever saw anyone, and you never heard a sound." Bad Nendorf quickly became known as Das Verbotendorf, the Forbidden Village. The commanding officer of the Bad Nendorf prison camp was Colonel Robin Tin Eye Stevens, who had previously commanded Camp 020 in Surrey, where the German spies had been interrogated during the war. Widely regarded as an authoritarian and a xenophobe with a legendary temper, Stevens boasted that interrogators who could break a man were born, not made. The camp would go on to employ 20 interrogators, 12 of whom were British. The other 8 were mostly German Jewish refugees, who were purposefully recruited because of their expected ruthlessness toward the German and Soviet prisoners both, given how much the Jews had suffered at the hands of both powers. The guards who secured the facility were also largely made up of British Army soldiers who had received suspended sentences for assault or desertion, and as Scotland Yard Inspector Hayward would comment, they were the sort of individuals likely to resort to violence on helpless men. It is clear that the camp at Bad Nendorf was carefully engineered to be as cruel as possible, down to the men who were employed to guard or interrogate the inmates within it. Those imprisoned there were frequently starved on purpose, woken up during the night, and then forced to walk up and down their cells from early morning until late at night, with breaks only for meals. Driven to the very edge of complete physical exhaustion, the process was thought to break the will of the prisoners so they could be more easily interrogated. When moving between different areas of the camp, the prisoners were expected to run, and if they failed to move quickly enough, the soldiers would kick at them to encourage them to move faster. Some guards had also been instructed to physically assault certain prisoners so as to reduce them to a state of complete physical collapse and thus make them more amenable to interrogation. Frequent beatings coupled with exhaustion and starvation were all carefully used tools to ensure prisoners cooperated with their interrogators. Whippings also made up part of the guards' cruel repertoire of tortures, a fact that Inspector Hayward initially considered unbelievable until Scotland Yard interrogated former guards who corroborated the allegations. Along with the physical torments, prisoners were also psychologically psychologically tormented, with threats to arrest, torture, and murder the wives and children of prisoners being encouraged, so long as they were never actually carried out. To a prisoner who was being tortured and beaten daily, however, such threats were likely completely believable. Prisoners who were deemed uncooperative during their interrogation were taken to a special punishment cell, where they were stripped naked and repeatedly doused with freezing cold water. The punishment would continue for weeks, even as temperatures outside dipped well below freezing. Prisoners were also handcuffed back to back and forced to stand in front of open windows in the middle of winter. Frostbite became extremely common, and many prisoners lost several toes and fingers, as well as a more delicate appendage due to the torture. One victim of the cold water treatment was an anti-Nazi who had already spent 2 years in a Gestapo prison camp. After the British prison was broken up and its survivors sent for medical treatment, he would be checked into a hospital where he weighed barely more than a skeleton. This former anti-Nazi would go on to say that during his imprisonment by the Gestapo, he had never undergone treatment like he received at the hands of the British. One NKVD officer captured and interrogated by the British at the Bad Nendorf camp claimed that he had been strung up by his wrists during his interrogations, and weights were added to his legs. His toenails were ripped out, and British officers would beat him with rubber truncheons. While Inspector Hayward's investigation would not find evidence to support this, the dozens of skeleton-like inmates that were taken for medical treatment after the camp's closure in 1947 attest to the very real possibility that this story was as true as many of the other verified accounts of torture. The investigation into Bad Nendorf would eventually lead to the court-martial of Commanding Officer Colonel Tin-Eye Stevens, as well as Captain John Smith, the camp's medical officer, and interrogator Lieutenant Richard Langham. Many of the guards and interrogators who had carried out beatings and other punishments were given pardons in exchange for evidence or testimony against their former officers. The trials were held completely in secret, and to this day, the British government refuses to allow for the publication of photos of the inmates as they were being rescued from the camp. Information can be difficult to ascertain on this secret British torture camp, and given the extremes of the abuses that took place there, it's not surprising at all that the British government would continue to keep a very tight lid on one of the most shameful chapters of its post-World War II history. After Bad Nendorf was closed, another British interrogation center was opened at the military base at Gütersloh. The inmates were suspected Soviet spies, and when it was demanded that drastic methods such as those used at Bad Nendorf should not be used, its commanding officer complained that if each prisoner was to have his or her arrest justified and that torture was not used, then there was little point in having an interrogation center at all. A statement that perhaps best exemplifies the British attitude on torture in the years after World War II. In the end, 372 men and 44 women would pass through the Bad Nendorf interrogation center, with many dying from starvation, exposure, or torture. The atrocities had been preceded by an interrogation center in London known as the London Cage, where German POWs had been beaten, deprived of sleep, and even threatened with execution. As terrible as the abuses of London Cage were discovered to be, however, Bad Nendorf would stand in a league of its own, and as a shocking contradiction to the idea of a democracy-loving Britain fighting to conquer the worst evils Europe has ever endured. Wyoming, 1911. The sun shines down on a baseball diamond as a pitcher throws a fastball that doesn't go in the intended direction. He stamps a foot on the ground, enraged that he's messed up again. What he does over the course of this game is literally a matter of life and death. He's not just playing to win, he's playing to survive, as are his teammates, all convicted felons playing for the Wyoming State Penitentiary All-Stars in the city of Rawlins. Murderers, robbers, men who've committed heinous crimes against the vulnerable, playing like seasoned professionals. This ragtag bunch of thugs and killers can play, there's no doubt about that. But the question is, can they win their way to a new life? Let's go back to the start. When the Wyoming State Penitentiary was opened in 1901, it was one tough place. This was a time when the West was called wild, and the outlaws pervaded the land. Still, not long before the prison was opened, you could say that criminals faced a rougher kind of justice if apprehended. Take, for instance, the story of the killer and robber Big-Nose George Parrott. He was arrested in 1881 and was sent to the local jail in Rawlins. Big-Nose, who certainly had quite the snout, must have thought his luck was in when he busted out of that jail. But it turned out that his rescuers were a local lynch mob. These townfolk weren't willing to wait for the authorities to deal with him. Around 200 of them strung Parrott up from a telegraph pole. Physicians managed to get hold of his body, but get this, his skull ended up being someone's ashtray, and parts of his skin were made into a death mask and a pair of shoes. The third governor of the state of Wyoming, Mr. John Eugene Osborne, firstborn actually wore them to his inaugural ball. If that sounds grim, you should know that many crazy things went down these days. Opening a penitentiary for housing prisoners there was somewhat more progressive than mob rule. Still, if you found yourself locked up around the time of the beginning of the 20th century, you could be sure that you weren't getting much sympathy from the townspeople you had stolen from, beaten up, or killed. No one blinked an eye when rustlers and murderers were treated inhumanely by a well-respected, eminently wealthy businessman named Otto Graham. You could say that this man made hay while the frontier crime rate was off the scales. He had a contract with the prison in the early days and pretty much ran the place. For every criminal that entered the prison, he received 57 cents per day per prisoner from the state. But he also ran the prison's broom factory and took all the profits from that. Inmates at the time complained that Graham was a man from the Dark Ages, saying that he had made the men work ungodly hours and barely fed them. They drank out of tomato cans and were given just enough food to prevent starvation. Rancid food at that. So in the first decade of the 1900s, Wyoming State Penitentiary was hell on earth. But for Graham, it was a goose laying a lot of golden eggs. Not surprisingly, morale in the prison was low. Prisoners had tried to escape and were killed while doing so. They killed each other, and on occasions, guards were murdered. In 1911, the progressive Senator Joseph Carey campaigned to get rid of Graham, and after he won the governor's race, he made Sheriff Felix Alston the big boss in the prison. This man, who'd been a gold miner, a water and ice man, a farmer, a national park guide, and a justice of the peace before becoming a sheriff, didn't believe that working the prisoners close to death was a way to fix their wicked ways. The broom days were over, and instead of hard labor, prisoners were educated and also entered intense physical fitness programs. When they weren't doing those things, they were sent out in gangs to fix the state's roads. This was a breath of fresh air to the prisoners, some of whom had never even been outside since the prison opened. They were no longer making brooms and pining for a square meal, but were being fed and enjoying activities in the prison yard. What activity did they enjoy most? Baseball, of course, the USA's favorite sport at the time. One day, Warden Alston was watching the men play and he thought, God damn it, some of those men ain't half bad. In fact, he mused while watching the men hit balls over the wall and throw curveballs that some of them would stand a chance of becoming professional. Alston got talking to his old friend, Governor Carey, and asked him if it'd be okay if the prison formed a baseball team. Carey wondered if forming a prison team could be a bit of fun, and he gave Alston the green light. Carey was also partial to gambling. This will tie into the story soon. The men were bought brand new uniforms and practiced as if they were professional players. They called themselves the Wyoming State Penitentiary All-Stars. And while the public thought the whole thing was a farce, the inmates would not only prove them wrong, but would change the public's perception of them. One person that absolutely hated the fact that the team had been made was Graham, who still held the belief that prisoners needed to be treated like animals. Not only that, he had the hopes that one day he might start his ultra-profitable broom operation again. It was arranged that the All-Stars would play their first game against a local team called the Wyoming Supply Company Juniors. No one gave them a chance, of course, because how could prison criminal vermin organize themselves and beat a team filled with real athletes? Imagine hearing the lineup. Leroy Cook at first, bludgeoned to death a barber and stole his money. On second, George Sabin, convicted of second-degree murder. On third, Jack Carter, who shot and killed an old hermit, cut him up and burned his remains in the fireplace. Pitcher William Boyer stabbed his father to death with a letter opener. The date was set. On July 18, 1911, a team consisting of murderers, rapists, a forger, and 5 thieves would go up against the mighty Wyoming Supply Company Juniors. Alston had high hopes, so high that he put down quite a large bet that his team would win. The stakes were also high for the team. If you won this game, they might well get time off their sentence. But if they made a mistake that cost the team the win, well, no time off, and not much chance of them having their sentence commuted. That meant a life or death game for some of the death row prisoners, and by God, they took it seriously. They didn't want to end up having their skin made into a pair of shoes, a story that no doubt haunted them. They didn't just win the game, a game against one of the best teams in the area. They absolutely trounced their opponents and did it playing with style and as gentlemen. The final score was 11-1 to the All-Stars. They were over the moon, not only because they'd achieved something great, but because it was looking like hard time was about to get softer. The outstanding player on the team was Joseph Sang. He hit 2 home runs, with one being a grand slam. If you're not a baseball fan, that means hitting a home run when there are men on bases 1, 2, and 3, thereby scoring 4 runs. It's about as good as it gets. The newspapers the next day were busy publishing stories about a bunch of convicts that had somehow turned into formidable baseball players. Referring to Tseng, the Washington Post wrote, "Slayer scores home runs." The first paragraph said, "Joseph Tseng, right fielder, is under sentence to be hanged." Tseng made 2 home runs hit over the penitentiary wall. One of his hits cleared the bases, bringing in 3 others and scoring himself. Tseng was on death row for killing his supervisor in the street. Well, the victim wasn't only his supervisor, he was also the husband of the woman that Tseng loved. This is what another newspaper wrote about him. Joseph Tseng, who was convicted of murder in the first degree and sentenced to death, played a classy game all the way through. He will petition the governor to commute his sentence to life imprisonment sometime this month. In fact, when people read about Tseng's brilliance, a lot of them sympathized with him. Okay, he had killed a man, but some people had said, hey, he isn't exactly public enemy number 1, he killed out of love, and man, he's a great athlete. Surely the state could commute his death penalty. Rumors started to catch fire. Word on the street was that if Tseng could keep on playing like a star, he might get what he wants. But there were others on the team that hoped for some mercy for their efforts. One of them was Captain George Sabin. The tale thickens here. You see, Sabin was arrested after he killed 3 sheep herders. He snuck up on them one night and shot them all dead, which really were cold-blooded killings. The thing was, though, those slayings were part of a long dispute between herders and cattle ranchers that had taken other lives. These conflicts were known as the Sheep Wars. There were actually local politicians that thought Sabin was in the right for doing what he'd done. Let's not forget, this was the Wild West. Another thing was the fact that Sabin was actually a friend of the prison warden Alston. It had been Alston that arrested him, and while he didn't want to put a close friend behind bars, he really didn't have much choice. He got 25 years for his crime, but was made the captain of the team and was allowed to leave the prison at times. What did he do when he was on the outside, you might wonder? Well, much of his free time was spent going around to the local saloons and brothels and talking to men who liked to make bets. He then told them all about his crack team of players and just how good Tseng was. Sabin would take 20% of their winnings if they bet. He was also in cahoots with Alston, whose money was used to place bets of his own. Well, when Mr. Graham, the broom man, got wind of this, at first he was appalled, and then later he wondered if he couldn't report the matter. He got in touch with Senator Francis Warren, a man who was hoping to oust Kerry as governor. While Graham had no proof that Kerry was in on the betting, he believed it to be true. Meanwhile, the guys on the team were having the time of their lives. They were eating better food than the rest of the prisoners, and they moved more freely around the prison. They played the same team again, and they won easily. Superstar Tseng was the man of the hour another time, hitting balls right, left, and center. The score was the same as the first time, 11-1. But as prisons go, even today, one man's good luck is another man's torment. Tseng was to be executed soon, even though he still had the public on his side, even though he was winning games. Then one day, an envious prisoner thought that he'd move forward that execution date all by himself. He saw Tseng sitting on a landing at the bottom of some stairs, and with an iron ball fastened to his legs, he climbed to the level above Tseng and pushed over a heavy box of sand. It would have hit and killed Tseng had he not at the right moment moved to the side. They won their next game 11-4, and again Tseng was the standout player, hitting home runs with as much ease as a major league player playing against a junior high school team. 3-0, and Tseng was the hero every time. Surely they'd not hang him by a rope. As the team were basking in the glory, inmates had been trying to escape. Having a baseball team practicing in the prison and going out for games wasn't making life easy for the guards. It created more chaos. Tseng also now needed to be protected, which took up even more of the guards' time. It wasn't really his fault, but it bugged some of the inmates that he was getting special treatment. His execution date arrived, and lo and behold, he wasn't sent to the gallows. Some inmates gossiped that the only reason that happened was because he was due to play and was making a lot of money for someone. They won their 4th game against the same team, but not with as much ease as they'd won the other games, the final score being 15-10. Over the course of 15 months, they won time and again, raking up a total of 39 wins and 6 losses, with each game being played in front of raucous supporters. In total, $136,000 had been bet on them, which is almost $4 million in today's money. It's thought that a lot of the winnings went into the pockets of local politicians and their election campaign funds. The heat was on Governor Kerry, a man whose reputation was at risk after Graham had started those rumors about him placing bets. It's likely because of that Kerry announced that he was cracking down on gambling. Soon after, the All-Stars were a thing of the past. Alston said that baseball would be replaced with educational programs, which seems to have suited a lot of the other prisoners not on the team. As for superstar Tseng, well, at least he got to live a little longer than he would have if he hadn't hit balls out of the park. It wasn't good enough, though, and he was hanged on May 24, 1912. 350 locals had petitioned the government to commute his sentence, but it didn't work. The man that once hit a ball through a third-story window in the guards' quarters of the prison wasn't going to escape the dreaded noose. Before his death, Tseng said, "I never received a square deal until I was brought to the penitentiary." He was grateful for having been able to play the game he loved, at least for a short while. At 2:45 a.m., the moonlight shining on the gallows, he took his final breath. The local newspaper wrote the next day, his steps were steady, and he went to his death in a manner which stamped him as a brave man. Albert Einstein once said, "If you put your hand on a hot stove for a minute, it seems like an hour. And if you sit with a pretty girl for an hour, it seems like a minute." We expect the same applies to prison. A minute in jail would seem like forever, and an hour of freedom would seem like a minute. Imagine then how someone must feel when sentenced to 1,000 years of imprisonment. Imagine serving the longest day with just 999 years and 364 days remaining. But how did people end up with the longest prison sentences ever? The following list of individuals given the longest sentences only include those not sentenced to life imprisonment, but instead given a specific amount of time in years. So here we'll mention that we have purposefully omitted people such as Terry Nichols, who earned 161 life sentences for his role in the Oklahoma City bombing, or Martin Bryant, who received more than 35 life sentences for the Port Arthur massacre. The reason for this is that a life sentence means different things in different locations, so their exact time is impossible to compare. In parts of the Netherlands, for example, a life sentence means that you are jailed literally until you die, which would of course vary from person to person. And some countries don't even have life imprisonment as an available option for sentencing. This includes Spain, Mexico, and Serbia. So for clarity's sake, we're sticking to more universal and exact sentencing of a specific year time frame. Now, let's begin. In 10th place on our list of the longest prison sentences ever is Inés del Rio Prada, who was given a 3,828-year punishment. We're talking centuries here and dozens of them. Now that is a long time. Clearly those determining her fate were sending a message, but what did she do to inspire it? Her many crimes were carried out as a member of ETA, a separatist group associated with regions of Spain and France. This group is well known to be violent, and Prada played a large role in many of its most destructive actions. This likely included countless additional killings, but it was the 1986 Plaza Repubblica Dominicana bombing for which Prada was convicted. The car bomb used in the attack was equipped with over 77 pounds of explosives and lethal shrapnel and fitted with a remote-controlled detonator. It left 23 dead and 32 wounded. Those injured included civilians. The dead were members of the police force on their way to further training and traveling via bus. The blast sent the bus flying in the air. However, despite this, Prada would not actually end her days in prison. She was released in 2013 against efforts of the Spanish government to prevent it. The European Court of Human Rights had intervened on her behalf, and she walked out as a free person. The 9th longest sentence on our list is the 4,797 years given to the Spaniard Henri Perot. This was a well-earned punishment. Perot was part of the ETA as well, and so it should be no surprise that he was guilty of many atrocities. In fact, he was convicted of as many as 26 murders, as well as 166 further attempts at murder. Thankfully, he isn't more accurate. Among other crimes, Perot was found guilty for his role in the 1987 ETA Zaragoza barracks bombing. Again, the attack used a large car bomb and targeted the civil guard, this time when they were sleeping. However, it also hit and killed their families. The 11 dead included 3 women and several children. Among them were 2-year-old twins. The week before, the Prime Minister had made a statement suggesting that terrorists were losing their edge. Many believed that ETA would soon be forced to open negotiations. Clearly, if this was true, they weren't backing down without a fight. But many would pay for their actions, including Perot, who is still serving time for his crimes. 5 men from Guatemala tie for 8th place at 6,060 years on our list of longest prison sentences. Their crimes focused on a small area in the middle of North Guatemala, and they were soldiers at the time. What they did there was particularly heinous, even to those well familiar with all kinds of criminal offenses. On December 6th, They worked as part of a unit of Kaibil's special forces to attack the town of Dos Aires. They collectively killed as many as 250 men, women, and children over the span of 3 days, and then left their remains in a well near some fields. By the time they moved on, as far as we know, there was no one left living. It took years and the efforts of both the US and Guatemalan authorities to bring any of those responsible to justice, and all 5 of these men were living in the US when they were arrested. Darren Anderson was sentenced to the 7th longest term in prison, with 11,250 years behind bars. This is a little surprising given the nature of his crimes. Anderson and 2 others repeatedly and brutally assaulted an elderly woman. Though Anderson was not present when his accomplices first noticed her at a gas station, the other 2 followed her and rammed her car while she drove, so she lost control and went off the road. She was then raped repeatedly in different locations. Anderson appeared on the scene later, trading places with one of the original men and violently assaulting Stuckey at a motel. Eventually, she was able to dial 0 and get assistance. In the end, he was given 2,250 years for all he had done. However, Anderson tried what countless criminals have attempted before him and appealed this sentence in hopes of a better one. This wasn't the best decision, and he was convicted again. And this time, an additional 9,500 years were added to his existing sentence, although he did later have this hefty sum reduced by 500 years. Lucky him! Also, he went down in Guinness World Records history. That's right, he holds a claim to fame as the criminal with the greatest jail term following an appeal. We're sure he's celebrating. Alan Wayne McLaurin earns a spot on our list with the 6th lengthiest jail sentencing of 21,250 years as an accomplice to Darren Anderson in the robbing, kidnapping, and rape of a woman. He was given the greater jail term as the one who initially kidnapped and assaulted the victim. However, McLaurin appealed this decision. It's a good thing he did too, as it got him 500 years fewer. So that only leaves him with what, around 20,750 years to go? The 5th longest sentence was handed down to Charles Scott Robinson of 30,000 years. The 8-time felon had his fate sealed after just a 35-minute jury deliberation, and he was convicted of 6 counts and assigned 5,000 for each due to savage acts against a 3-year-old victim. Prior crimes included burglary and concealing and being in possession of stolen property. Life without parole was not an option for the jury, which led them to do the next best thing: give him thousands of years sentencing. As he maliciously preyed upon the defenseless and innocent, they didn't want to see him back in society. The Corrections Department did eventually commute the sentence to 6 life terms of 45 years, but the judge on the case had expected this. He ordered all to be served consecutively. What this means is that once Robinson is up for parole for 1 life sentence 13 to 15 years later, he'll have to wait another 13 to 15 years for each of the ones that remain. Only then will he actually be eligible to leave prison. That's 13 to 15 years times 6. In other words, the soonest he could be let free would be in 78 years when he's 108 years old. 3 Spanish men, Emilio Suarez Trashoras, Jamal Zugam, and Abman El-Nawi, earned sentences of 34,715 years, 42,922 years, and 42,924 years respectively, or the 4th, 3rd, and 2nd longest sentences ever. Together, they were responsible for an act in 2004 that was labeled the deadliest since the Second World War. It was the worst ever in Spain's history. It took place on March 11th of 2004, 3 days before the general elections. Unfortunately, no one knew what was coming. 10 separate blasts on 4 commuter trains detonated within minutes of each other. 191 were left dead, and almost 2,000 were wounded. At first, the act was attributed to the violent separatist group ETA that both Prada and Perot belonged to. However, before long, the investigation's focus turned to Al-Qaeda. This greatly influenced the subsequent election, as the prime minister in charge had supported the US-Iraq invasion. Needless to say, a new party was voted in not long after, and he was replaced. The 3 men given thousands of year sentences were part of a much larger operation that involved a minimum of 18 additional terrorists. Trashoras, Zugam, and El-Nawi were ultimately quite lucky to be citizens of Spain, where laws dictate that they will serve at most 40 years for their crimes, not the 30 to 40,000 of their sentences. Finally, Kamoy Tipiaso of Thailand tops our list with the longest sentence of all at a whopping 141,078 years for a crime that actually set the Guinness World Record for corporate fraud. Her crimes involved the use of a pyramid scheme. To succeed, she abused the trust and connection she held as the spouse of a high-ranking Royal Thai Air Force officer and as an employee of the Petroleum Authority of Thailand. She also hardly looked criminal. Young, attractive, with raven black hair and thick eyelashes, she may have used charm to her advantage. In any case, she along with 7 others ran what's known as a chit fund in the 1960s. Those who invested in it believed that they owned shares in oil and would enjoy high returns. Of course, they were wrong on both counts, and their money was only used to line Kamoy and her accomplices' pockets. 16,231 people were defrauded in this way for decades. In the end, all those in top government positions were compensated for their losses. We assume the less powerful were not. After restitutions were made, her trial began. Luckily for Kamoy, a Thai law passed that same year made it so that fraud convictions came with limits for allowable sentences. Her 141,078 years were far in excess of that amount. It capped a punishment at 20, which, while still long, is next to nothing in comparison. But get this, in the end she didn't even serve this much. After 8 years behind bars, she was released, serving less than half the allowable maximum penalty. All of the hair on your body grows at about half an inch per month, and that includes beards. If you're locked up for 2 years and never shaved, that means your beard could be a full foot long. It's pitch black and freezing cold. Your hands are busted from being strung up, and it hurts to wipe the tears from your eyes. The cell you're confined to is 4 stone walls and a door. You cannot hear or see anything. Suddenly, men arrive at your cell. They muscle you through the prison, take you outside, and strip off your clothes. A rope is fastened around your ankles. You're to be pulled through London in front of jeering crowds. All the while, the streets shear the skin from your body. You're hanged, and then you have the limbs cut from your body. And as your life starts to fade, the last thing you see are your own insides being pulled out. You're now dead, but your head will be removed, preserved in tar, and put on a pike atop London Bridge for everyone to see. Now, that's a tough prison. The story you've just heard is something that happened to the Scottish knight Sir William Wallace, a man who fought for Scottish independence and was captured by the English and charged with high treason. And in case you're wondering, Mel Gibson's Braveheart movie about Wallace didn't exactly portray the real events, but hey, Hollywood censors might have had something to say about evisceration and dismemberment on the big screen. Others would share a similar fate to Wallace. But before we get to life in the cell or on the rack and the matter of human rights, you should know something about the Tower of London. The mighty tower was founded in 1066 after William the Conqueror had successfully invaded England. This grand edifice was a symbol of his power, a reminder to the folks of London that things had changed in their hood. It would take about 20 years for William to finish his fortress. In the ensuing centuries, this place would become a complex network of startling buildings. It would become perhaps the most impregnable building on Earth, surrounded by high walls and towers, and also protected by a moat. Before you start imagining things though, no, there were no sharks in that moat, nor any sharks with frickin' lasers on their head. Medieval kings would enjoy its luxurious palace without the threat of danger looming upon them. It surely couldn't be breached. Well, what's quite amazing is that when it was first overrun, it wasn't a bunch of well-trained knights that got into the place, it was a bunch of peasants who in 1381 started a peasants' revolt over harsh treatment by their ruling masters. They did some executing of their own, and even sat on the king's bed as if to mock the ruler. So yes, the Tower of London was a great and magnificent unbreachable edifice, but not when 400 peasants had enough of being treated like animals. The tower became a last line of defense, an extravagant palace, an armory, a mint where cash was made, and the home of the crown jewels. But today, we're interested in one part of the tower, and that's where the alleged offenders went. People were sent to the Tower prison from as early as the year 1100, and there have been some big names that had to stay in the cells of the prison over the years. It's actually quite surprising that some of the last people to be imprisoned there were the infamous London gangsters, the Cray twins, who did a short stint in the tower in the late 1950s after assaulting a policeman. It's not likely that we're ever going to do a show on a more historic prison, so we might now ask how conditions changed over the years in there. What fate beheld someone accused of treason in the 1500s? Was torture always part of prison life? What was the worst thing that could happen to a person in the Tower of London? And did anyone ever make the best of it? We'll start with one of the prison's first famous occupants, which was one Ranulph Flambard. England's new king Henry I sent Ranulph to the Tower after accusing him of embezzlement in 1100. You could say that prison security was a bit lax in those days, because as legend has it, Ranulph had managed to get some wine smuggled in. He then gave that to the guards and they ended up catching a few drunken Z's. Ranulph then used a rope to climb down the tower. He managed to cross the English Channel and find safety in Normandy. Okay, so we have some very early security issues, but this kind of thing would happen again. In 1597, a couple of imprisoned Catholics managed to do the rope trick again and get out of the tower. This must have been especially hard because they'd been horribly tortured and had their hands mangled. Imagine climbing down a rope when your hands are broken. And just to let you know what kind of torture you might receive as a 16th century prisoner, we have a record of it for you written by someone at the time. Part of it goes like this. Twice he's been hung up by the hands with great cruelty on the part of the others, and no less patience on his own. The examiners say he's exceedingly obstinate and a great friend either of God or the devil, for they say they cannot extract a word from his lips. Recently they took him to the rack. Looking at the rack was enough for this guy and he pleaded for mercy, and mercy he was granted. In 1716, perhaps the greatest escape took place when a man named the Earl of Nithsdale got out. He'd been accused of being involved in an uprising and he was awaiting the head-chopping block. But he got one over on those guards after some female friends visited him in his cell. They quickly dressed him in women's clothes and piled his face with makeup. The women confused the guards by coming and going from the cell, and at one point the cross-dressing man left. There were a few more escapes, but we'll leave that topic there because we know you're dying to hear more about prison conditions. We want to tell you about perhaps the worst kind of solitary confinement known to man, and this was one particularly cramped cell that got the nickname Little Ease. It was called Little Ease because once you were in there, you could find little ease. It was built to be so small that an occupant could no way stand or lie down, but even in a sitting position, the back would have to be bent. There was no light in the cell either. So you might be left for days with the occasional bread and water bent in double. This brings a whole new meaning to doing time in the shoe. This wasn't always the case though, and nobles at times had a much better experience in the Tower of London prison. In 1321, an 11-year-old girl named Maud de Battlesmere, the Countess of Oxford, spent some time with her mother and siblings in the tower. Her father was hanged, drawn, and quartered for taking part in a rebellion, but during her stay in the tower, she wasn't treated so harshly. It was the same for the famous English spy and global explorer who's known for first bringing tobacco to England in the 1500s. His name was Sir Walter Raleigh, and he did some stints in the tower when he got on the wrong side of the elites. But his cell was more like a cozy bedroom, and he was allowed to read and conduct his scientific experiments. They took his head in the end, and when he looked up at the axe, he said, "This is a sharp medicine, but it is a physician for all diseases and miseries." That was a positive way to look at execution. So a stay in the Tower of London prison back in the day could have been absolutely awful or not that bad, depending on who you had annoyed and what crime you'd been accused of. A man named Guy Fawkes didn't get a nice room with a view, and instead he was confined to the dungeon keep. This was about as low as a man could go, but Fawkes was one of the conspirators behind something called the Gunpowder Treason Plot. On November 5, 1605, he was found guarding 36 barrels of gunpowder under the House of Lords, which is part of the Parliament of the United Kingdom. If successful, they would have blown the place to pieces and killed a lot of important people. That's partly why we have the anonymous masks today and why the sadistic Brits still celebrate each year how this man named Guy cruelly met his end. Snitches might get stitches these days, but we think if modern-day prisoners were put through what Guy Fawkes endured, then they would give up their friends. At first, Fawkes said his name was actually John Johnson, but he was proud to admit that he wanted to blow all those people up. He remained quiet as to who his co-conspirators were. At that time, the worst kinds of torture had been made illegal, so it was called for that he endure a softer kind of torture first. This included a little bit of beating here and there and being suspended in the air by the wrists. Fawkes didn't snitch after that, and the king even said that the man had a Roman resolution. So the ante was upped and the torture was taken further. He was likely stretched out on the rack, and his resolution soon faded. Having your limbs pulled out of their sockets will do that to a person. He did last one day of torture though, and only spilled some beans on the second day. Historians don't exactly know what went down in the torture chamber, but his badly written signature points to the fact that his hands weren't really working. He and the other plotters got the same treatment as William Wallace. You know, that being pulled by the ankles by a horse thing, and then the hanging until almost dead and subsequent loss of limbs. It was designed to keep the person alive through the worst of it, or as was said back then, to put to death halfway between heaven and earth as unworthy of both. The weakened Fawkes got lucky. He died while being hanged. hanged, which must have annoyed some of his haters. So conditions weren't always great in the Tower of London prison, and sometimes the best a person could hope for was a comfortable cell followed by a quick and painless beheading. Torture wasn't all that common, and it happened mostly to those charged with the worst of crimes and information to give. The 16th and 17th centuries were particularly bad centuries for torture. During that time period, there were 3 kinds of tortures preferred among the torturers, and one was called the manacles. It's worse than it sounds, but Fox apparently sailed through the manacles and kept his mouth shut. It consisted of putting steel handcuffs on a person, but then hanging them in the air from those cuffs for a certain period of time. This would cause a lot of pain and sometimes broken wrists. If no information was forthcoming, then the person might experience something called the scavenger's daughter, which was basically having your body parts strapped in irons in a very, very uncomfortable position. It's been called a kind of inverse of the rack. You're not pulled apart, but painfully wrapped up. Then you had the rack, and you all know about that. A woman named Anne Askew, who supported Protestantism in the 16th century, was so badly tortured on the rack that her shoulders and her hips were pulled from their sockets, and her elbows and knees were also dislocated. She fainted, and then they stretched her again when she was conscious. But this woman didn't snitch. They gave up interrogating her and later had to carry her body to her execution. On the 16th of July, 1546, aged 24, she was burned at the stake. In the 20th century, the prison was just as miserable as any other British prison back then. The last person to be executed there was one Joseph Jacobs. In 1941, he was executed by firing squad after being accused of spying for the Germans. In all, the tower housed royals and nobility who might even have servants in there. This was more like house arrest, and some prisoners were even given time out of their luxurious cell to go on hunting trips, but get caught counterfeiting money or rebelling against the powers that be, and life in the tower was a person's worst nightmare.
Sometimes, the best way to assess how people will behave and conform within a particular environment is to create that environment and study them like you would rats in a lab. That's exactly what happened at Stanford University in the early 1970s, when a research group wanted to investigate the psychological effects of power and authority between prisoners and prison wardens. Today, we'll take a closer look at how that went down in this episode of the infographic show, The Stanford Prison Experiment. The Stanford Prison Experiment was conducted at Stanford University between August 14th and 20th, 1971 by a research group led by psychology professor Philip Zimbardo, who ran his experiment with a group of unsuspecting college students. It was funded by the United States Office of Naval Research as an investigation into the causes of difficulties between guards and prisoners in the United States Navy and United States Marine Corps. The aim was to investigate how readily people would conform to the roles of guard and prisoner in a role-playing exercise that simulated prison life. In particular, Zimbardo wanted to find out whether the brutality reported among guards in American prisons was due to the sadistic personalities of the guards or whether it had more to do with the prison environment. So how did he go about creating this laboratory prison? Zimbardo converted a basement of the Stanford University Psychology building into a mock prison and then advertised for volunteers to participate in a study of the psychological effects of prison life. More than 70 applicants were interviewed and given personality tests until 24 ideal test subjects had been chosen. They were all male students who were paid $15 per day to take part in the experiment. The group was then randomly split into prisoners and guards. One dropped out, leaving 10 prisoners and 11 guards and 2 reserves. The guards worked 8-hour shifts in sets of 3, and the prisoners were housed 3 to a cell. There was solitary confinement for prisoners who broke the rules in an attempt to keep the mock prison as authentic as possible. To make it even more realistic, the college students were arrested at their own homes and taken to the local police station. They were fingerprinted, photographed, and booked before being blindfolded and driven to the psychology department of Stanford University and led to the basement prison. They were then stripped naked and had all their personal possessions removed, which were locked away. They were given prison clothes and bedding, and they were referred to by their number only. All this was done without warning, to shock the test subjects so their reactions were as if this were a real-life situation and they were real prisoners. The guards were dressed in identical uniforms, they carried a whistle around their neck and a small baton borrowed from the police. They also wore special sunglasses, so eye contact with prisoners was impossible. No physical violence was permitted, but the guards were told to do whatever was necessary to maintain law and order in the prison. Zimbardo observed the behavior of the prisoners and guards, as well as acted as a prison warden. So what were the results of this controversial psychology experiment? Within a few hours of the experiment beginning, some guards had already started to use their newfound authority to harass the prisoners. At 2:30 in the morning, the guards used their whistles to wake the prisoners up and do a count. This was to remind them of their number and also to demonstrate that the guards were in control. They provoked the prisoners by giving them pointless and boring tasks to accomplish, and if they disobeyed the rules at any time, they were told to do push-ups. One of the guards stepped on the prisoners' backs while they did push-ups, making it much harder. And being in the prison also quickly influenced the behavior of the prisoners. They gossiped to the guards about each other, and some even began siding with the guards against prisoners who did not obey the rules. But the first day passed without too much trouble breaking out, which may have lulled the guards into a false sense of security for what lay ahead, because during the second day of the experiment, things got a little out of control. The prisoners removed their caps, ripped off their numbers, and barricaded themselves inside the prison cells by putting their beds against the door. The guards forced the prisoners away from their cell doors by letting off a fire extinguisher. Then the guards broke into each cell, stripped the prisoners naked, and took the beds out. The ringleaders of the prisoner rebellion were placed into solitary confinement, and the few prisoners who did not take part were given special privileges, deliberately causing a rift in the prison population. The relationships between the guards and the prisoners started to change. As the prisoners became more dependent, the guards became more divisive towards them in order to hold on to control. As the experiment progressed, some prisoners faced emotional and psychological effects from the experience. Only 36 hours in, and prisoner 8612 began suffering from acute emotional disturbance and disorganized thinking, which resulted in uncontrollable crying and rage. The guards told him he could not leave, and he soon began to act crazy and to scream, at which point the psychologists realized they had to let him out. The guards held a visiting hour for parents and friends, exactly as would happen in a real prison. Zimbardo also invited a Catholic priest who had been a prison chaplain to evaluate how realistic the prison setup was. The chaplain interviewed each prisoner, telling them the only way they would get out was with the help of a lawyer. Half of the prisoners introduced themselves by their number rather than name. When prisoner 819 spoke to the chaplain, he broke down and began to cry hysterically. The psychologist told him to go and rest in his room before taking him to see a doctor. Zimbardo wanted the experiment to run for 2 weeks, but just 6 days in, he had to unlock the doors. Christina Maslach, a Stanford PhD who was brought in to conduct interviews, was shocked when she saw how the prisoners had been abused by the guards. "It's terrible what you are doing to these boys," she said. Years later, Zimbardo noted, "It wasn't until much later that I realized how far into my prison role I was. I was thinking like a prison superintendent rather than a research psychologist." The experiment demonstrated that people will readily conform to the social roles they are expected to play, especially if the roles are as strongly stereotyped as those of the prison guards. In the words of Maria Konnikova, a Russian-American writer with an AB in psychology who writes for The New Yorker, the lesson of Stanford isn't that any random human being is capable of descending into sadism and tyranny. It's that certain institutions and environments demand those behaviors and perhaps can change them. The Stanford prison experiment is one of the most controversial studies in the history of social psychology. It was even turned into a film in 2015, starring Billy Crudup, who played Philip Zimbardo.
It's August 11th, 1934, and along with 136 prisoners, you're on your way to what will become known as America's toughest prison. You guys are what the authorities have called the incorrigibles, because in the prisons where you've come from, you just couldn't stop causing trouble. All of you have been called violent and unpredictable, and so you're being taken to the penitentiary version of hell. You sit there on a specially designed train coach, handcuffed and surrounded by 60 FBI agents, U.S. Marshals, and other security. The atmosphere is solemn, and each of you grisly-looking hardened criminals each eye each other with distrust. Every chug of the train is foreboding. In your mind, it says to you, "You're going to hell, you're going to hell, you're going to hell." You're not wrong. That's how the first shipment of prisoners traveled to Alcatraz Island. None of those guys were prisoner number 1, since Alcatraz had some leftover army prisoners. This place has been a military prison before it became the penitentiary renowned as being an inescapable hellhole. Let's just pretend you were one of these prisoners again. You arrive on that train in a place called Tiburon at 9:40 a.m. A barge is waiting in the water there, and that's how you'll get to the island located in San Francisco Bay. The train carriage where you've been sitting could perhaps go down as one of the most well-guarded trains in the history of rail. Imagine if some of the USA's most violent prisoners all got loose, something akin to a movie about the Wild West. No one escapes this day. Many of the men around you are convicted killers, and others are notorious bank robbers. You can make a book out of your combined rap sheets. Each of these guys have been called an agitator, and the authorities have noted that the men are desperate. Most of them have planned prison escapes from other places, and it's well known that they will kill anyone who gets in the way of their freedom. For that reason, you'll be guarded by highly trained men, and when we say highly trained, we don't mean in rehabilitation. They are men that were chosen for their toughness, not their ability to help improve prisoners' behavior. The two men in charge, the warden and his assistant, have been nicknamed the Iron Men. When you finally get to the ferry ship that will take you to the island, you are handcuffed with another man, and both of you are shackled together. You're ordered to walk 10 feet forward and cross a gangplank, and then onto the ship. You're surrounded by law enforcement and prison guards. All this is happening without the press looking on, because the authorities have kept the operation a secret. Only one lone photographer got news of the move. At Alcatraz's dock, you and the guy you're chained to walk between rows of guards. 2 by 2, you're marched through the gate into the yard, and then into the cell house. You're searched and given a number, after which you're allocated a cell. Now your cuffs are removed and you are free of the other man. But before you can go into your cell, you're taken to the bathhouse and stripped naked. You're examined in every nook and cranny of your body, and then told you can wash. You're then taken to a cell and the door is locked. Outside is a sign that has your name and number. The authorities will later say that the entire operation went perfectly. Okay, so what does your cell look like? You're assigned to Block B. You might move to C later, and Block A, you'll learn, isn't used much at all to incarcerate men. D Block is solitary, a segregation center where a prisoner can be locked up 24 hours a day. These cells are sometimes referred to as confinement chambers. You might get let out in the yard for an hour once a week if you get on the right side of the guards. But other than that, you face total isolation if you're sent there. So your cell in Block B is 5 feet by 9 feet. Proverbially speaking, if you were to swing a cat in there, you'd kill it. Inside that cell is a cot that you can sleep on, and it's made out of steel. It folds against the wall when not being used because there really isn't that much space in the cell. There's a steel shelf to sit on and a steel shelf to put things on. There's also a basin and a toilet. Everything you own when you first get into that cell is a toothbrush, some tooth powder, 2 towels, and a cup. There will be books to read, so you can fill that shelf at some point. You will be able to get visits if you're good, but only once a month and non-contact. If you fall sick, then there's a hospital in the prison. Over the coming year, some big names will arrive at the prison, including the man known as George Machine Gun Kelly. Others that arrive have been convicted of what the press call most atrocious crimes. Alcatraz is called the end of the line, the last resort. It holds formidable robbers and ruthless murderers, and it especially holds anyone who has tried to escape from another prison, or a prisoner that has hurt or killed a prison guard where he was housed. Maybe the most famous criminals to stay on the rock is the mafia crime lord Al Capone. He actually arrived shortly after you. So there you are, sitting in your cell. You receive a booklet, and it's called Regulations for Inmates USP Alcatraz. It tells you that what you have right now is what you're entitled to. The clothes on your back, the roof over your head, and some bathroom items. Anything else you might receive is a privilege, and to get more things you'll have to show good conduct and a good work ethic. You might even get some time taken off your sentence. But show bad conduct and the opposite might happen. You might lose privileges, get some time added on, or be sent to those isolation cells. This is nothing you haven't read before. In bold letters, the booklet tells you that there will be no trading, gambling, selling, giving, or loaning. They mean this too. You will work 5 days a week, 8 hours a day. The rest of the time will be recreation time and cell time. You can watch a movie twice a month, and if you show good conduct, you'll be able to go out to the yard and play handball. You're also told that this won't happen just yet, since your first 30 days will be spent in your cell. This is called the quarantine period. It doesn't sound too bad, only you guess the guards will be stricter. That is very true. You'll wake up at 7 a.m. and you'll be counted. You must be absolutely silent during this time or you'll be disciplined. This rule of silence will be the thing that gets to you the most, and the guards are serious about it. You might have your own cell, but the silence kills you. You can try talking through the toilet bowl, but that will get you in serious trouble. You can talk when you eat with the other prisoners. The food at least isn't that bad. In fact, you're quite impressed with the chow. For breakfast one day, you get oatmeal, milk, sausage, fried potatoes, toast, and coffee. For dinner, you get some bean soup, roast beef, and veg. For your supper, you get pork and beans, salad, more coffee, and bread. On another day, the breakfast is similar, but dinner consists of breaded cod, potato chowder, cabbage bread, and tea. For supper one evening, you get vegetable soup, spaghetti and meatballs, fruit pudding, and bread. They even throw in some spiced apples. What's going on? You're eating better than you did on the outside, and a lot better than the many Americans living in abject poverty. In the years to come, the delicious food at Alcatraz will become legendary, and it'll make any prisoner in the present day wish he was taken back in time as he chows down on his single slice of moldy bread and dubious slop filled with mystery meat and gristle. At Alcatraz, the wardens believe that healthy food and tasty food will lead to good behavior and cut down on violence. 3 good meals a day should keep the prisoner in good physical and mental health. You are what you eat, and your warden believes slop doesn't align with good behavior. Alcatraz is quite progressive in this respect. Okay, so you've got your pounded beef steak with gravy and mash, and you're not going to complain about that. The silence thing gets to you, but as you follow all the rules, you at least get time on the yard and books to read. It's a bit cramped in the cell, but at least you don't have to share with a man who has a history of atrocious violence. What can go wrong? Well, that routine is so strict that it can feel oppressive. It's final lockup at 4:50 p.m. and lights out at 9:30 p.m. And until the next day, you're not supposed to make a sound. A man named Edward Wutke doesn't take to Alcatraz very well. He's prisoner number 47, and he's the first man to take his life in there. More will follow. There is bullying, of course, and this leads one man to severely hurt himself. He wants to get transferred because of the bullying he faces daily. So for you, as long as you don't get bullied, life could be okay. You just have to adhere to the strictest of routines. You even get to go to the library, and since you're eating well and exercising, you might actually get rehabilitated. In fact, as an average prisoner, you'll get to go through almost 100 books a year. As the years go by, you'll get the chance to use a musical instrument and listen to a radio. The problem is, what if you don't follow the rules? Well, that's when Alcatraz turns into Hellcatraz. Let's just add that it's very easy to break the rules. That code of silence is enforced with enthusiasm, and you also have to look presentable at all times. Your cell has to be spotless, and come rain or shine, you have to work really hard. There's no shirking at Alcatraz, and so you might say it's run in a zero-tolerance style. Now, with that in mind, the place is full of notorious criminals with problems of self-control. Things can go wrong. Let's say one day you just can no longer cope with the oppressive rules and you start talking at night and not cleaning your cell. You're sent to isolation, and then you do the same again. You hit out at people and talk back to guards. That's when you go to D block and get put in one of the cells from 9 to 14. This is known as the hole, and before you get thrown in there, you're stripped naked and beaten. The guards will come back and torture you now and again. You lie on a cold concrete floor and there is no light that comes into the cell. You can shower once a week, and you might get out in the yard for an hour in the week. The rest of the time is spent in that cold, dark cell, being treated worse than an animal. You're given no toothbrush or soap to clean yourself. At one point, a guard throws cold water on you. The cell stinks like a sewer, too. And you can forget about that tasty food. You're given 4 slices of bread a day, and then once a week you get a proper meal. In conclusion, Alcatraz is a foreboding place just to look at, and it comes with ruthless men who might bully and kill you. The food is good, but some men just can't cope with the rules. This is what one of your fellow inmates says about that. Men go slowly insane under the exquisite torture of restricted and undeviating routine. Men crack, and then they're punished, sometimes severely, and this happens a lot. The question is, will you crack or will you get through it? A Russian researcher enters a room where he expects to see his human test subjects alive and well. Instead, he witnesses absolute pandemonium. He hears screams of the damned, and in front of him is a body that's been torn apart and eviscerated. It looks as though the Antichrist himself has been in the room. Even the survivors have had chunks of flesh ripped from their arms and legs, their ends of their fingers shown exposed bone. Their faces are sheared of skin. What is this inferno of madness, thinks the researcher. This wasn't exactly how the experiment was supposed to turn out, he thinks. Okay, the food wasn't great. We might have made those beds a bit more comfortable, but tearing each other to shreds over a bit of lost sleep? Come on, guys, that's not very comrade of you. That nightmare scenario is straight out of the famous Russian sleep experiment, if you believe it really happened. Let's start from the beginning of the story, and then we'll tell you what our team of world-class sleuths dug up on the truth behind this horrific experiment. So, it's the late 1940s, and Soviet-era researchers have created a stimulant that they believe can keep a person awake for a long time, which is handy when you're fighting a war. In the Second World War, the Germans had their version of such a stimulant, which was a formidable methamphetamine called Pervitin. The Americans and the British would dose their troops with the amphetamine Benzedrine, which was similar to your garden variety speed. The Soviets are looking to up the ante and use their own version of a drug, which won't lead to a total wipeout after a 3-day-long binge. They've made something special, but they need to test it on humans first. It's not hard to find test subjects since prisoners of war were aplenty in the 1940s. And where prisoners were concerned, bypassing ethical considerations wasn't such a big deal. They set up a test area where 5 subjects will stay. It's a sealed environment into which the researchers can release the stimulant in gas form and check if the levels of oxygen are okay. The subjects have been given dried food, each a bed with no bedding, running water, and a toilet. The researchers listen to the subjects through a microphone, and there are cameras through which they can monitor the subjects. The only portholes to the outside are 5-inch thick glass windows, which are barely good enough to see a shadow from. The scene is set, and the 5 men seem in good spirits for the first 3 days. The gas is doing its job, and the researchers are pleased about that. One researcher tells another, "Nazi meth, what a joke. Just wait until the world sees what we've cooked up. Comrade Stalin will be most pleased." The subjects have agreed to try and stay awake for 30 days, and have been falsely informed that if they can make the 30 days, they'll get their freedom. Such a deal seems fair to them. Things turn slightly dark around the 4-day mark, when the subjects start discussing war and the horrors they've seen. They speak of traumas, continual nightmares, other ghastly things they witnessed. Day 5, and things get worse. The men start showing signs of psychosis, talking to themselves and things that are not there. They grow paranoid of each other and start whispering into those microphones, telling stories about the other subjects. The researchers, of course, know all about sleep deprivation. After 5 days, the mind can turn on a person. Hallucinations can seem real and horrifying. But they wondered, was it the loss of sleep or the gas itself? Suspicions about the gas effects were more solid at day 9, when one guy just started screaming, howling like a banshee and running up and down the room. He screamed so much he seemed to tear his vocal cords, because after a few hours he squeaked like a children's toy. A few more days passed and there was an eerie silence. The men could not be seen from the cameras. They were alive for sure since the oxygen levels indicated 5 breathing men, but where were they? The researchers hadn't wanted to interrupt the study, but they felt that they had no choice, and so said into an intercom, "We're opening the chamber to test the microphones. Step away from the door and lie flat on the floor or you will be shot. Compliance will earn one of you immediate freedom." They heard one voice respond. It said, "We no longer want to be freed." What was this? Had they been getting ripped on that gas and were now addicted? The researchers said there's nothing we can do but open the door. They opened the vents and let fresh air displace the residual stimulant. What the researchers heard next was the men screaming again, pleading for more of that damn fine gas. WTF, thought one of the Russians. Those guys are seriously hooked. They opened the doors on day 15, and to their surprise saw one man was dead. You know what the scene looked like because we laid that out for you in the intro, but we didn't tell you what happened shortly after the gruesome discovery of the half-eaten man and the wounded survivors. On closer inspection, the researchers saw that the wounds on the men were very bad. They looked as if they might have been self-inflicted too. They had torn the skin and muscles from their own chests, which revealed the horrific sight of the men's lungs. Each man, it had seemed, had performed this macabre surgery on himself. Blood vessels that were still working had been removed. Other internal organs were seen laid out on the floor like a piece of art, and the men were going to eat those morsels. They were dining on their own bodies and doing it with enthusiasm. The researchers called for backup, not daring to go near those poor wretches. They closed the door to howls of the men pleading for the gas to come back. When soldiers arrived to help remove the subjects, the extrication process wasn't exactly fun. One of the subjects ripped a man's throat right out, while another soldier had his balls removed. 5 soldiers lost their lives in total, but some of the victims took their own lives after the event. Once the subjects were out, the doctors injected enough morphine into them to sedate a Canadian moose, but the men still fought like wild beasts. One subject bled out and his heart stopped beating, but he still carried on screaming, "Give me gas! I need gas!" A doctor had some bones broken during that grim spectacle. The 3 others were eventually sedated and strapped and moved to a secure facility. The researchers talked to each other, saying things like, "That wasn't meant to happen, was it?" They hated to admit it, but maybe the Nazis, the Brits, and the Americans had done the right thing in just plying their troops with top-notch crank. The surgeons got to work on putting the missing organs and bits of viscera back into one man, but this guy almost broke through his restraints. When the docs finally got the anesthetic into him, the man's heart stopped and he died right on the spot. The autopsy showed he had broken 9 bones and his muscles were torn all over his body. When they tried to fix up the next man, they decided 2 deaths were enough and didn't use an anesthetic. They patched him up nice, sewing his ruptured organs and laying skin grafts on him. The head surgeon said this man should not be alive after what he's gone through, but he admired his own work. A nurse commented that during the surgery the beast had been smiling at her. She did wonder how male carnal instincts can remain functioning during the worst times. Maybe with death comes the need to create something new, she philosophized, but quickly shook herself out of her reverie. The man suddenly started making a wheezing sound as if he wanted to say something. The nurse, quick to catch on, handed him a pen and a pad below it. The man wrote, "Keep cutting." Wow, she thought, what a maniac. She was glad she'd not reciprocated his flirty smile. As for the other maniac, he laughed like a hyena during his bodily reconstruction. He said he wanted that gas, the good stuff. And when asked why, he said he just needed it to stay awake. The surgeon mused, if these guys weren't so hell-bent on eating themselves, they'd make excellent night shift custodians. Cleaners, perhaps, or maybe security. But he knew all too well that they couldn't be trusted to wash their hands. Then, a former KGB agent had an excellent idea, something that had amazingly escaped everyone else's thoughts. Why not put these poor suckers back on that gas? He said it seems the problems all start when they all go into withdrawal. Hi, they're okay, if not a bit hyper and paranoid. We can work with that. Once back on the gas, they were fine and dandy, but then something strange happened. The EEG monitor showed crazy brain activity, but then it just died down. One man flatlined. Finally, he just died. His last boost of that junk had done him in, or at least it seemed so. The last guy ended up back in the study room with the other guy seemingly dead on the bed, but 3 researchers were in there too. Suddenly, one of the researchers shot the commander and then shot the subject. He then shouted out loud, "I won't be locked in here with these things, not with you. What are you? I must know." The subject that was shot but evidently was not dead replied, "Have you forgotten so easily? We are you. We are the madness that lurks within you all, begging to be free at every moment in your deepest animal mind. We are what you hide from in your beds every night. We are what you sedate into silence and paralysis when you go to the nocturnal haven where we cannot tread." That was almost the end. But for good measure, the researcher put a bullet into the man's chest, which might have breached the Hippocratic Oath somewhat, but hey, harsh times call for harsh measures. The end. So, a lot of people seem to think this all actually happened. Now, without much investigation, one can easily tell by reading this catastrophic flash fiction that it's written by someone whose grammatical skills need improving. Not only that though, the story simply doesn't make sense at times. Quite a few times someone dies and then just comes back to life, and we don't think it's on purpose by the storyteller. He just forgets what he said or her. On another part, the writer says that the oxygen levels indicated the men were alive, and the researchers knew that, and then in the next part he said the researchers were not sure if they'd all died. But there's more than bad writing that gives this away. Where do we start? Well, we might not need to tell you that you cannot rip out vital organs and lay them on the floor like a bunch of textbooks. That's pure fiction. Those men would have died from blood loss or shock. Remember that they were discovered like this and left for some time before the soldiers came. Okay, you say, but that was the gas working. This was a secret experiment that went wrong. High on that wicked drug, maybe men could routinely come back from the dead and rip out their own organs and even do a bit of flirting when the mood took them. How do we know that it isn't true? Well, there is the matter of recorded history and plausible science. No gas has ever been discovered that can keep a person awake for 15 days. Never mind turn that person into a self-loathing zombie. There is no history of the experiment anywhere but on a website that's known for its scary, fictional, I'll say it again, fictional tales. It would be astounding if one author alone, writing badly from his or her bedroom, had access to more secret information than the CIA and the British Secret Services. As we said in the story, and we embellished this part ourselves, many soldiers on all sides of the war broke so bad that they could stay awake longer. The officers were handing out that stuff like candy, but not even the most dedicated ice fiend could stay awake for 15 days. And those badly buzzed soldiers would have likely only done 24 to possibly 36 hours awake. The Pentagon has even done studies on this, and even if men are forced to stay awake for more than 48 hours, they will become pretty slow and pretty much useless as soldiers. They'll make tons of mistakes, which is not ideal in war when you have to be constantly alert. Sure, the speed helped the Germans with their blitzkrieg attacks, but the drugs had to be taken with some precautions. With this in mind, the Russians would not have even tried this experiment. There is something called Morphin syndrome that can cause severe delirium and very bad insomnia, and sufferers can go into a dreamlike state. We say dreamlike because even if they don't sleep, they will have microsleeps. Plus, no one with this disease has ever started eating themselves. Sure, perhaps a noxious agent sprayed into a room full of guys can kill someone, but it's very unlikely it could turn them into gas-addicted zombies. There's nothing in scientific literature that supports anything in this experiment. There's another thing that can cause massive sleep loss, and that's called fatal familial insomnia. But that's passed down through genes and isn't caused by environmental agents. And again, it doesn't and it will never make someone just want to rip out their own organs and eat them. There's just nothing that exists in this world that aligns with the story, and if it did, we would expect it to have appeared in medical journals before it became an internet meme. Then again, many of you have been asking in the comments how we managed to put out so many episodes per day. Maybe the entire staff of the infographic show are crank-addicted zombies with an undying lust for human flesh after all. Of course, that's preposterous. But isn't that exactly what a team of crank-addicted zombies with an undying lust for human flesh would want you to think? The Russian sleep experiment isn't a bad story, but it could have been better. Sleep deprivation is actually a torture that has been used by militaries, and that itself can drive a person half crazy. Still, in this story, when you add the addictive gas and the organ rug and the reanimation, it just isn't believable. September 26, 1945. A newspaper in the USA runs a story with the headline, "Women Prisoners Subjected to Cruel Nazi Experiments." The article talks about how 45 German men were about to stand trial in a British court for crimes they perpetrated at 2 concentration camps, crimes that included hanging women upside down and artificially inseminating them. In what the newspaper called sadistic procedures, many of the women twisted in great pain and soon often died. That's an extremely grim way to open up one of our videos. But if you know anything about Nazi medical experiments, you'll know a great many horrific things happened in those camps. The Nazis weren't conducting these experiments just because they were sadists. Even though many of the people involved may have had sadistic impulses, there was usually a reason for the experiments, such as replicating battlefield injuries, dealing with hypothermia, and testing all manner of medicines and experiments where humans stood in for rabbits. Importantly, where this video today is concerned, the Nazis were obsessed with genes, human reproduction, and the female reproductive organs. The exact number of victims from all Nazi medical experiments is unknown. According to a research paper published by the U.S. National Institutes of Health, there were 15,750 documented victims of Nazi human experimentation. But researchers say the number of victims would have been much higher. It's just that many of the crimes were not documented. The experiment started in 1942, but really picked up speed in 43, and the horrors didn't stop until the end of the war when the camps were liberated. About 1/4 of the people who were experimented on survived, although often with horrific injuries. Many of them were women, many were Polish, many were Jewish, but many were also Christian of various nationalities, civilian, and sometimes military. Of those who survived, quite a number testified against the Nazi doctors, nurses, and camp supervisors. It's thanks to those testimonies that we can tell you this story today. If you haven't seen any of our other shows on the matter, we'll give you some examples of the experiments. Many German soldiers on the battlefield fighting in the winter months in the frigid towns and fields of the Eastern Front risked dying from hypothermia, so the Nazis conducted freezing experiments on inmates in which they froze people and then tried to heat them up. Not only were these experiments terrifying for the victims, but many of them died. There were between 360 and 400 hypothermia experiments that were conducted on 280 to 300 victims. Then there were the seawater experiments, in which the victims of choice were usually Roma people, an Indo-Aryan ethnic group that reside in Europe. Such people have been oppressed and hounded for centuries, and World War II certainly added to this historical trauma. The Nazis introduced limitations on freedom of movement for Roma and Sinti people, and in 1935, new race laws made them racially alien, denying them rights as the Nazis did with Jewish people. Over 5,000 Roma and Sinti were forced to live in the Lodz Jewish ghetto, from which many were often sent to Auschwitz. In total, 23,000 Sinti and Roma were deported to Auschwitz throughout the entire war, and around 21,000 died, often murdered in the gas chambers. Some were forced to drink seawater. Others took part in the often deadly low-pressure experiments, in which they were subjected to dangerous levels of low pressure, similar to what a Nazi pilot could face. Both these experiments were about replication, trying to see how German soldiers might overcome adversity. One of the most infamous experiments not related to the battlefield became known as the twin experiments. You might have heard the story of the notorious Dr. Josef Mengele and his experiment that involved trying to attach 2 Roma children surgically. The story still stands out as an act of utmost depravity. Although it seems Mengele didn't try this often, still you can hear testimonies that defy understanding, such as the words of Vera Kriegel. when she said she saw Mengele kill people with an injection through the heart. According to her, Mengele had a thing for eyes. She once said she walked into his laboratory and saw a whole wall of human eyes. In some experiments, he'd inject adrenaline into children's eyes in an attempt to change their eye color. In the years that we've been researching Nazi experiments, we've read about scores of women whose limbs were transplanted, whose tissue was removed in painful surgeries, whose wounds became infected, and in some cases the wounds were purposefully infected so the Nazis could test various drugs on the women. Other experiments included shooting people in the chest or neck after they'd been given a drug that should make the blood coagulate. There was an experiment involving 100 twins in which the kids were given injections of bacteria that caused something called the Noma disease, an infection of the mouth or genitals, which usually causes boils to spring up and can become gangrenous. Mati Alon, who arrived at Auschwitz at age 9 in 1944, said one of the things that forever scarred her memory was seeing an experiment in which Mengele forced a dwarf and a Roma woman to have sex. As we said, the Nazis weren't doing any of this out of some sick perversion. In this last experiment, the purpose was related to breeding. As you know, Nazis were obsessive in their drive to create a pure Aryan race. This is one of the reasons why the Nazis were so heartless when it came to conducting experiments on people they deemed racially impure. They spent a lot of time and effort trying to ensure these supposedly racially impure people could not procreate. In what became known as the sterilization experiments, the Nazis secretly blasted prisoners with powerful X-rays in their genital region. This made them sterile. In theory of what we call eugenics, the Nazis believed they could alter the gene pool, both by trying to wipe out certain genes and promote certain people to procreate. In the early 1900s, many countries, including the US, promoted eugenics, but the Nazis took this to an entirely different level. This video today is mostly related to eugenics, so let's talk some more about that in the wider sense. The Nazis wanted to propagate what they deemed to be pure blood. They went to great lengths to produce a nation of what they believed were Aryan kids, and this is why they introduced something called the Lebensborn program. These were special homes for women who were going to have what the Nazis believed were racially pure children. Women were encouraged to breed with SS men, and if single, they could be cared for at these new homes away from the prying eyes of the public. If a woman could give birth to a lot of so-called pure children, she might even have been awarded the Cross of Honor of the German Mother. The program, led by Heinrich Himmler, wasn't really that successful. Himmler was hoping to fill Germany with blonde-haired, blue-eyed children, or ones that could at least pass as Aryan. But over 9 years of this eugenics project, only around 7,000 children were born into the Lebensborn homes. Himmler was disappointed. The program was close to a failure. He believed that even with Germany's abortion laws, there were still around 100,000 German women who had abortions each year and were going to have racially pure kids. Therefore, he thought if he opened these homes, they could be taken care of and Germany would see an increase in its Aryan population. He wanted them out of the abortion clinic and into the home, where they would be well looked after. These homes, it should be said, were not places where SS men came to impregnate women, by force or as a financial transaction. These pregnancies, according to researchers, usually happened the natural way. Still, Himmler didn't see enough Aryan kids being born, so the Nazis went to some very immoral lengths to make it happen. They kidnapped around 200,000 Polish kids, some of whom were given to German families and handed new identities. They were literally grabbed from the streets and later sent to children's education camps, known as Kindererziehungslager. This also included around 20,000 kids from the Soviet Union and another 10,000 from the rest of Europe. Not all of them were accepted, and the so-called rejects were treated in ways that beggar belief. After the kidnapping, the kids were tested as a means to see their value as potentially good Aryan Germans. Some were chosen, given new names, and taught Nazi values. Those that didn't pass the test were often thrown to the wolves at the concentration camps, where their future, as you already know, was incredibly grim. If the kids were sent to a place called Medizinische Kinderheilanstalt, located in Lubliniec in Upper Silesia, they were often exterminated. Here's an actual snippet from a German report written in this place that was found after the war. The children were administered barbiturate products, mostly luminol in large doses, from 0.1 to 0.6 per day regardless of age. Initially, all the children vomited after they'd been given luminol. Some of them seemed to be adapting. After some time, they got a high fever, stopped eating and made growling sounds, had foaming mouths, sometimes with blood, and they eventually died. The same thing happened in a place in Szczecin in southern Poland. But this was only for young kids since it was a nursery. There, they were often experimented on. Here's a testimony from a woman named Ruta Hechkuvna. They were beaten, tortured, pinched. During feeding time, they were placed on laps with their head down, their noses were clenched, and a portion of food was poured into their throats while they were being punched in their heads. The children were so scared of the feeding time. If they ended up at Auschwitz, their fate wasn't any better. Their records showed that there was a practice of something called needling, in which children aged 8 to 14 were cruelly killed with a long needle filled with a substance, phenol. This toxic substance was often injected into their necks. Death occurred soon after. Here's an actual report from Auschwitz talking about something that happened during the winter of 1942 and 43. Circa 90 boys were brought by Palich to Block 20, and they were killed there with injections by an NCO paramedic, Sherpa. Sherpa, who later testified in court, was a medical aide. He later said he saw 20 kids receive injections to their hearts. He was asked, "You didn't protest when you saw the children lined up to be given carbolic acid injectors?" "I did, but in the end I just handed the bottle containing the acid to a trusted inmate who had been standing ready with a hypodermic needle." He added, referring to the kids as gypsies, "Death was always instantaneous." Back to Gerhard Palich. He was one of the absolute worst Nazis at Auschwitz, known for his speech when the prisoners arrived there. Part of it went, "With joy we will hound you all through the chimneys of the crematoria. Forget your wives, your children, your families. You will die here like dogs." He bragged that he killed around 25,000 people with a gun to the back of the head at what was called the Death Wall. He was so corrupt that the Nazis moved him to different camps where they hoped he might not cause as much damage and steal so much. He took particular enjoyment in hurting kids. A Polish prisoner at the camp, Witold Pilecki, who wrote down a long list of Nazi atrocities, said about him, "In Block 11, Palich, a particularly dedicated torturer, would hunt children. He told girls to run around a closed yard and would shoot at them, killing them like rabbits. A true degenerate, tears and death followed him. Having committed a most heinous crime, he would come out smiling, handsome and polite, calmly smoking a cigarette." Said by many to be the worst of the worst, Palich never faced trial. He was likely killed in action before the war ended. The Nazis were so wrong-headed, they could capture Polish kids with blonde hair and blue eyes and act surprised that the kids seemed genuinely German. Hans Frank, the general government in Nazi-occupied Poland during World War II, summed that up when he said, "We see a blue-eyed child, we are surprised that he's speaking Polish." Many decades after the war, German men and women were still finding out that they'd been born into one of those homes or were one of the kidnapped kids. Right after the war, teams were sent to Germany to find some of the kidnapped Polish kids, but by that time, they had been brainwashed and others simply didn't seem to realize they'd been kidnapped. Some just said they were not Polish or Ukrainian or Russian, they were German. "So please go away," they pleaded. We think now you have a good idea of how the Nazis tried to create life and how they rubbed it out when they deemed certain people were not racially pure. This brings us to the main topic of the show today, artificial insemination. Let's talk about that newspaper article we talked about in the introduction. Part of it went, "The Nazis practiced artificial insemination of nude women prisoners, hanging helplessly head down. So painful were the experiments that many victims died." The same article said survivors were sometimes given deadly bloodstream injections of gasoline and disinfectants. You already know this was pretty common for kids, but adults often face the fate too. One of the witnesses to these experiments was Helen Hammermash, a woman described by the newspaper as a 25-year-old Polish Jewess and former medical student. She said the women were strung upside down and given something to stimulate their hearts, after which the sperm was introduced. This happened at Oswiecim and Belsen concentration camps, so let's have at 'em. The latter was in northern Germany. When the British liberated it on April 15, 1945, they found around 13,000 bodies scattered around and 60,000 people, most of whom were close to starving and death, seriously ill from disease, or both. As it was often a holding camp for POWs, many of the people who died there were Soviet soldiers, although it was also home to many Jewish people. Two of its most well-known occupants, who both died there, were Margot and Anne Frank. Oswiecim was part of the Auschwitz complex, which consisted of 40 different camps. This was a massive camp where 1.1 million of the 1.3 million sent were exterminated, mostly Jewish people. At the Belsen camp, sometimes called Belsen-Belsen, the Brits could not believe what they were seeing. Rotted bodies laid around the entire camp, some so putrefied they fell apart when the Brits tried to move them. The stench was unbearable. The BBC reported, "Babies had been born here. Tiny wizened things that could not live." A mother, driven mad, screamed at a British sentry to give her milk for her child and thrust the tiny mite into his arms, then ran off crying terribly. He opened the bundle and found the baby had been dead for days. In 1945, the world heard about the Belsen trials, which was one of the first opportunities for the public to understand the depravity of what happened in those camps. The Brits had arrested a number of Nazis who worked there, from the commandant Joseph Kramer to the camp doctor Fritz Klein to the head warden Elizabeth Vulkenroth. Prior to the British and also Canadian soldiers entering the camp, the Nazis had agreed to a truce so there would be no more fighting. This meant the swift arrest of those who worked there, men and women who had to help with the cleanup. Around 500 people had been dying each day from typhus. It really was a sight you could call hell on earth, although not every prisoner was in such bad condition. Some prisoners had arrived earlier from another camp, and they looked a lot better. Those men, once Belsen was liberated, turned on the Germans and foreign capos, or prisoners forced to work for the Nazis, and murdered around 170 of them. But the ones that survived that ordeal faced trial. This included 12 capos, 16 female SS members, and 16 male SS members. 3 SS members had been shot trying to escape, while 17 SS members were already dead from typhus before the trial began. Many of the transcripts, and there are a lot of them, show how people, sometimes Polish, became capos and were accused of cruelty to other prisoners. One Polish capo got 15 years in prison after being accused of beating a sick French prisoner to death by hitting him over the head with an iron soup ladle. As much as we'd like to tell you about those transcripts, we'd be here until next week doing it, so now let's focus on artificial insemination again. While sterilization was the norm at many camps, the main artificial insemination testimony came from the woman we just mentioned, Helen Hammermasch, who you know was a student of medicine. She'd run away to Hungary when the Nazis entered Poland, but was sent back and handed over to the Gestapo. In her testimony, she talked about the train journey to the camp, saying, "There was a selection immediately after we got out of the train, and some people were sent by vehicles to the crematorium, I being one of the few to be sent to the camp." She said they were lined up and chosen in a selection process and beaten if they cried. Dr. Kramer and Dr. Klein performed the selection. Klein once said, "My Hippocratic oath tells me to cut a gangrenous appendix out of the human body. The Jews are the gangrenous appendix of mankind. That's why I cut them out." Klein and Kramer weren't the only problem. These people who ran the camp were just as bad, according to Helen. Of her work in the leather factory, she said, "They treated us very badly there. We had 2 overseers called Pfor and Otto Graf. Graf beat us every day, and once a girl called Maria Dombrowska was so severely beaten that she was taken away dead. He kicked her and beat her with a rubber truncheon." She said Graf once beat a French girl in the factory and let her lie on the floor next to the workers. She lay there all day in pain and died in the evening. Helen said that Graf worked half the time in the crematorium. She explained he enjoyed telling the women in the factory about how much better female bodies burned than male bodies. He was an out-and-out sicko. Since Helen was a medical student, she got to work in the hospital, and that's where she saw people dying after being injected with petrol and Lysol. Her testimony is astonishingly vivid. She talks of women being beaten, of men being beaten, including a Russian man kicked to death by Dr. Kramer, but her words about artificial insemination are actually about something she was told. The American newspaper got that part wrong. In her actual testimony, she said, "I was told by one of my friends who worked as a nurse in the hospital that in Block 10 of Auschwitz, there were young women on whom experiments were made with artificial insemination. The victim was hung up by her legs and was injected in order that her blood might circulate freely. She then received an injection in which sperm was introduced. After a short time, the victim was in great pain and quite often, not long after, died." Also in the Belsen trials, a woman named Ada Bimko testified. She described herself as a Jewess from Poland and a doctor of medicine. Thousands of people were taken from her town in Poland. The day she was pushed onto a train, many were sent loaded onto trucks for the crematorium. She said in court, "My father, mother, brother, husband, and small son of 6 years of age were included in that number." It's hard to imagine what that would feel like, but at the camp she experienced another hell, where the goal of every day was just to survive. One day she met a woman who was talking about ending it all. She asked the woman what happened, and the woman told her the Nazi doctors had just tried to artificially inseminate her. She said she was worried that they had rendered her physically incapable of bearing children. There isn't too much other evidence in the Belsen trial testimonies that we can find regarding artificial insemination. Truth be known, so often the women were tampered with and had no idea what the doctors were doing to them. At Auschwitz, these experiments on women's reproductive organs usually happened in Block 10. One of the main experimenters was the gynecologist Karl Klauberg, who was highly regarded for his work on female fertility hormones. He was known to sterilize women, sometimes by injecting caustic substances into their uteruses. A report stated these procedures sometimes led to peritonitis and hemorrhages from the reproductive tract, leading to high fever and sepsis. One of the women in Block 10, Dr. Dorota Lorska, later talked about her experience calling the block a mix of hell and a madhouse. She said Klauberg caused sterilization by irradiation. He often injected the women with something, but she didn't know what. She did know that sometimes he removed the women's ovaries. In her notes, she wrote, "I cannot say what he plans to do with them in the future. He performs all the procedures personally with the help of untrained staff who do not understand what he is doing." In another passage, she wrote, "There was no doubt that this gynecologist, so very well known in the academic world, was devising artificial insemination experiments." We should add here that the first successful birth of a child born through artificial insemination didn't happen until 1978, but the first animal to give birth that way, a rabbit, was in 1939. Perhaps the Nazis thought they could pioneer this procedure. We can find no evidence that explains why they were performing these experiments, as all records have been destroyed. It's well known, though, that all over the world, scientists in the 30s and 40s talked about the possibility of artificial insemination. The British wondered if they could repopulate their country with it. The New York City gynecologist, Dr. Francis Seymour, talked about the wonder of eugenic babies. It's hardly surprising that the Nazis would try to make it a reality. Klauberg spent just 7 years in prison after the war, but after being released was captured again after an uproar, and he died before his next sentence. Mengele escaped to South America and died there in 1979, aged 67. One question you might have is, where did the sperm come from for those experiments? Here's a testimony of a man who said the Nazi doctor shoved something up his backside to make him ejaculate. He said, "He then turned the stick and caused an involuntary ejaculation of sperm. A female SS officer who worked with the other officer held 2 pieces of glass underneath my genitals in order to collect a sample of my sperm for the lab. They then made me stand up on a special machine that gave electric waves to both sides of my genitals again until sperm was ejaculated." Both Dr. Klein and Dr. Kramer were hanged by the British, as were 6 other men in the Belsen trials. 3 women were sent to the gallows too. One was the guard Irma Gressa, the so-called hyena of Auschwitz, said to be a very feared woman in the camp due to her sadistic proclivities. 18 other people were also sentenced to 1 to 15 years. Former Luftwaffe pilot, now SS doctor Sigmund Rascher chooses 2 prisoners from a lineup. Russian men barely out of their teens. These strong men have no idea they're about to become test subjects in Rascher's profoundly unethical medical experiment bearing the innocuous title, "Warming Up After Freezing to the Danger Point." A few hours later, Rascher jots down in his notebook, "Subject 115763 naked, time of death 64 minutes. Subject 115306 clothed, time of death 102 minutes. This was not unusual. Those that underwent the Nazis' freezing experiments rarely escaped with their life intact. We know a little bit about the experiments of a Dr. Rascher due to the fact that many of the letters the Nazis wrote while they were experimenting on prisoners were later used in evidence during the Nuremberg trials. Take, for instance, this letter dated October 9, 1942. The correspondence is between Rascher and Heinrich Himmler, the Reichsfuhrer SS. After Adolf Hitler, Himmler was the most powerful Nazi that ever shouted Sieg Heil. The letter starts with, "I ask for leave to submit to you the second interim report concerning the freezing experiments." Interestingly, lower down he also wrote that Professor Holzluner declined to perform the freezing experiments on humans out of shame. Rascher then added, "I shall take over the exploitation of them," meaning the humans. It seems not all Nazi doctors were happy about experimenting on humans. In the testimony of SS officer Rudolf Brandt, he talks about Himmler, stating, he further asked Rascher to submit the names of the people who were opposed to experiments on human beings and stated that such peoples were to be considered traitors. Still, if there were such traitors, they were in a very small minority. They did exist though, with Himmler writing to Rascher in one letter, "I regard those people as high and national traitors who still today reject these experiments on humans and would instead let sturdy German soldiers die as a result of these cooling methods. I shall not hesitate to report these men." Such was the mindset of the inner circle of Nazis. Being outside all day during the winter in some parts of the world could easily be lethal. Ending up in the bitterly cold waters could be lethal much faster. The Germans wanted to know how to treat their soldiers when they were suffering from hypothermia. These experiments happened at the Dachau camp from August 1942 to May 1943. They consisted of freezing a person to the point of death, although sometimes that part did end in death. This was useful information for the Nazis since such experiments gave them an idea of what a person could survive. Another part of the experiment was called warming up, in which the doctors used various methods to warm someone, so they didn't just survive but were brought back to good health. It was almost as if the Nazis were playing God. trying to resurrect people from what looked like certain death. What's also interesting is that there seemed to be some competition going on between various doctors, with some medical personnel expressing that experimenting on humans wasn't necessary when animals could be used. In some cases, shaved cats. Rascher told Himmler that humans were indeed better, saying in one letter that he needed more Russians. You might wonder why Russians. The answer was the Germans had to fight on the Eastern Front, where temperatures could get very low. The Germans weren't used to this. The Nazis wondered if the Russians had a genetic advantage when it came to surviving the cold, and if they did, they wanted to know why. Further down the letter, he wrote, "The experiments of rewarming by body heat, which were ordered, will be carried out as soon as the women necessary for this experiment arrive, in about 2 days. I shall report the results of this experiment separately." That didn't mean that Rascher was now freezing only women, but that he was addressing Himmler's contention that the best way to warm up a freezing man was to place him between the bodies of 2 women. It was Himmler's contention that animal warmth, in this case human warmth, was better than artificial warmth. He told Rascher that a fisherwoman could take her half-frozen husband into bed and revive him in that manner. This was actual testimony from a former Nazi during the Nuremberg trials. The man who said the words was again Rudolf Brandt. The report on the rewarming of an intensely chilled human being by animal warmth stated that the experimental subjects were cooled until they all lost consciousness. The test persons were then placed between 2 naked women in a spacious bed. It was noted that several of the subjects revived sufficiently to perform sexual intercourse. These experiments were supposed to emulate what it would be like when one of their pilots was shot down and ended up in the frigid North Sea. To replicate this, sometimes prisoners were dropped into a bath of ice-cold water. According to researchers, some of them were anesthetized and others weren't. Although we said that Professor Holzlerner might have felt some amount of shame regarding the human experiments, we found a report with his name attached to it that beggars belief. The other names were Rascher and Dr. Finke. The letter concerned giving narcotics to a person before they were forced into the ice bath. It started, if the experimental subject was placed in the water under narcosis, one observed a certain arousing effect. The subject began to groan and made some defensive movements. In a few cases, the state of excitation developed. This was especially severe in the cooling of head and neck. The report said that the person then suffered from a kind of rigor, after which the subject started twitching. The report concluded, with still more marked sinking of body temperature, it suddenly ceased. These cases ended fatally without any successful results from resuscitation efforts. Some subjects were naked, but others were fully dressed, usually in German Air Force uniforms to create a facsimile of natural conditions. Rascher's letters illuminate the details. He wrote in one report, "The experimental subjects were placed in water, dressed in complete flying uniform, winter or summer combination, and with an aviator's helmet. A life jacket made out of rubber capac was to prevent submerging. In one experimental series, the occiput, or brainstem, protruded above the water, while in another series of experiments, the occiput, brainstem, and back of the head were submerged in the water." We'll come back to why he didn't always fully submerge the person. The doctors checked the person's body temperature throughout and also wrote down obvious clinical manifestations, which in simple terms just means the outward signs of what happened to the freezing person. They also checked for biochemical and physiologic changes, which again relate to the changes in the body. If the person died, an autopsy would reveal more information. So there was Dr. Rascher, thinking he was doing his bit for the cause. During the Nuremberg trials, his experiments were called inhumane and criminal. And of course, they were. But what's also so strange about the man is he lied when he wrote down the findings of his experiments, or at least he lied from time to time. This didn't help the cause at all. It's now said that Rascher was operating under the orders of another person. That was Erich Hipke, the chief medical officer of the Luftwaffe. Together, they came up with the ice-cold water experiments, and they also left some prisoners outside in the cold during the winter months at Dachau, usually naked. The reports we have now state that when left outside, they were usually there for around 14 hours. As for the tub of ice, that could be up to 3 hours, although most people died well before that. The prisoners were usually male, but of various nationalities and ethnicities. We can't always be sure who was part of the experiments because the Nazis destroyed much of the evidence when the war was lost. But thanks to those letters, as well as a 228-page report from the investigator, Leo Alexander, we know some things. We know that the prisoners were forced to do the experiment most of the time, but sometimes they volunteered on the promise that they'd be awarded for their participation. It's reported that those rewards weren't given if the person survived. In total, there were between 360 to 400 experiments, which amounted to between 280 and 300 victims. The temperature of the bath that people were dropped into was sometimes between 2 and 12 degrees Celsius. During the winter, the North Sea's temperature is usually about 6 degrees Celsius. As for hypothermia, that occurs when the temperature of the body drops below 95 degrees Fahrenheit. So if a person sits in a bath of water that's around 40 to 50 degrees Fahrenheit, very serious injury and death can happen pretty fast, within possibly 30 to 90 minutes or around the 1 to 3 hour mark, depending on various factors. It's these factors that the Nazis wanted to understand. In some of the reports, the Nazis wrote that when a person was immersed in water that was 5 degrees Celsius, they could generally tolerate it for about 1 hour. If the water was 15 degrees Celsius, they would usually last about 4 or 5 hours. One report said that no test subjects survived having their body temperature dropped to 25 degrees Celsius and then being heated up to 28 degrees Celsius. Some prisoners who later testified to seeing the experiment said they saw around 90 people die, but noted that some did survive after being warmed up. They also said 2 people became mentally ill, but we don't know when this mental illness occurred. The onset of severe reactions to the cold was fast, as was stated in another report. It said the rapidity of which numbness occurs is remarkable. It was determined that already 5 to 10 minutes after falling in, an advanced rigor of the skeletal muscle sets in, which renders the movement of the arms especially increasingly difficult. That report also said that these considerations had to be taken seriously given that German soldiers in cold water would likely lose most of their manual dexterity. The report noted it is certainly extremely difficult even at the beginning of numbness to climb onto a rubber raft, to blow up a rubber raft for one person, or to make use of instruments or to signal or call. One of the ways the Nazis warmed prisoners up was by immersing them in hot water, but that was too very dangerous. It produces a kind of shock, what we now call rewarming shock or the afterdrop effect. You can look at any medical website these days and it'll tell you that if you're dealing with a person suffering from hypothermia, do not put them in a hot bath. Instead, passively warm them using dry, unheated blankets. Dr. Rasher disagreed with this, stating that passive rewarming didn't work. He wrote in one report, "Rewarming by animal warmth, animal bodies or women's bodies would be too slow." He explained this by saying, during attempts to save severely chilled persons, it was shown that rapid rewarming was in all cases preferable to slow rewarming because after removal from the cold water, the body temperature continued to drop rapidly. According to research, the Nazis used at least 7 different procedures to warm a person. We know that in 2 experiments a warm bath was used, although some witnesses later said they saw someone being immersed into boiling hot water. We also know that massage was used in some experiments, as were heated light sources. But again, there isn't much data as to how they worked. We should say here that in Rasher's reports there are a lot of inconsistencies, which is one reason why things didn't end too well for that guy. Rasher's report also stated heart failure was the reason for freezing experiment deaths, but that's also come into question, as has his conviction that if a person is not immersed above the neck, he won't become hypothermic. Academics now state that Rasher was not even qualified to conduct such experiments, which is why it seems they were either botched or the results were made up or exaggerated. One scientist later wrote, "The Reichsfuhrer expressed special interest in the hypothermia project and traveled to Dachau several times to witness experiments. Thus, the study represents a private venture by 2 unqualified ideologues, conducted in a prison setting quite alien to the standards of academic environment." We now know that because Rasher was so close to Himmler, no other scientists dare question what he did, even though they knew full well he was somewhat of a charlatan. At the Nuremberg trials, it was said that their connections were so strong that practically every superior trembled in fear of intriguing Rasher, who consequently held a position of enormous power. When you hear this next bit of information, you'll agree that he certainly fitted the glove of what we call mad scientist. With so many dead bodies around him, Rasher made use of some of the human skin. With it, he created saddles, riding breeches, ladies' handbags, and other personal items. He sold what he made to some of his colleagues. But his end would come when it was discovered that some of his children weren't his, and he actually abducted them. He was also accused of killing his lab assistant and of being a scientific fraud. For these reasons, he ended up in Dachau himself. Himmler felt this guy he'd protected and supported for so long had not only lied to him, but made him a fool. On Himmler's orders, on the 26th of April 1945, Rasher was killed by firing squad in his cell. The last words that Rasher heard were, "You pig, now you've got the punishment you deserve." Well, that's if he lived long enough to hear them. In the 1980s, some scientists said the data might be useful to help save lives. Baruch Cohen, a Holocaust researcher, had something to say about that. He said, "Although use of Nazi data might benefit some lives, a larger bioethical problem arises. By conferring a scientific martyrdom on the victims, it would tend to make them our retrospective guinea pigs. and we their retrospective torturers. For some time, it was assumed that Rascher's experiments could be of some use, but academics were quick to state that there was great risk thinking these grotesque Nazi medical exercises yielded results worthy of consideration and possibly of benefit to humanity. It's thought the number of victims was around 27,000 for all the various experiments, with about twice as many men as women. About 20% of the victims were Jewish, with about 2% being Roma and Sinti. Other ethnicities were stated as other or unknown. When we look at the nationalities, there were many. The countries with the most victims of experiments were Germany, Poland, Russia, Hungary, and Austria, although over 6,000 cases were marked as unknown nationality. There were some countries' residents picked out for lesser-known experiments, such as a handful of British commandos who were captured in Norway. The Nazis tested new kinds of amphetamines on them in high-performance experiments. Now you need to watch the World War II Nazi breeding plan, or have a look at this.